I was born in San Antonio, Texas. I have 2 siblings. So my sister was the oldest, then it was me, and then my brother. My mom was a single mom raising us by herself. But my mom was not stable enough to watch me and my siblings. She was a drug addict and she had problems drinking as well. So CPS took us away. And I was about 9 years old at that time. Chevel was my mom's brother.
Hi, sweetie.
Hi. It was scary, confusing, really sad, but I was relieved because I was gonna be with family and my siblings were gonna be with me. And we would always stay together as a family. Looking back, I wish I ended up being separated and with strangers. I remember being home alone with my Uncle Chevel, and we were on the couch in the living room.
Hey.
I remember him grabbing my leg and rubbing my feet. And then his rubbing started going up gradually on my legs. And it felt wrong. And he did look at me and he did say, I don't want you to tell nobody about this, not even your Aunt Laura. This is our secret. So I felt like it was something that wasn't supposed to be happening. I felt very nervous and scared and confused. I didn't know what to think because I didn't know what was going on. I was so little and I didn't know if it was right or wrong. In the days and times that followed, I didn't feel comfortable being around him. I think avoiding my uncle made him find other ways to be alone with me. And the abuse started getting worse. In the bedroom that I shared with my older sister, we had a bunk bed. And I slept on the top, and my sister slept on the bottom. We would leave the hallway light on with our door kind of cracked because we were kind of scared of the dark. I remember seeing like a shadow underneath the doorway. I would hear the door creaking or hearing my Uncle Chevel climbing up the ladder to get onto the bed with me. Knowing that he was climbing into my bed was very scary. I didn't understand what was going on or what he was doing in the bed with me. There was a part of me that felt that I had done something wrong for him to be touching me the way he was. First time that my uncle touched me, I was about 9 years old, and it was like that for a few years, and it progressed. The first time that he raped me, I was 12 years old in middle school. I did hope that my sister would hear or maybe catch him one time or something, but she never did. I really didn't understand what was going on, so I didn't know how to defend myself at the time. I knew his one rule was not to tell nobody. So as a kid, I didn't. At some point, I did tell my Aunt Laura that I needed to tell her a secret, and she said, okay. We went to her room and we sat on her bed, and I told her, Uncle Chevo has been getting into the bed with me and, touching me in ways that I don't think are right. And she just closed me off.
Stop.
She told me that she didn't think that he was capable of doing anything like that, and that she knew that I was lying. She made it very clear that I wasn't allowed to talk about it to anybody.
Not a word of this outside my house.
She's supposed to be my mom, so I would expect her to protect me and do something about it, and I didn't get that. I felt very sad and betrayed that my Aunt Laura didn't believe me, and scared because I didn't know who else I could go to and tell, because if she didn't believe me, who is gonna believe me? I couldn't trust nobody. This picture was me and my sister goofing off in our bedroom. I was roughly 12. If anybody else was looking at this photo, they would see a normal, happy child. But behind the mask, she wasn't normal, and she wasn't happy. It was a cover-up, but she had to pretend that she was happy. I was told not to tell nobody the truth, and I was scared of what was gonna happen if I did tell the truth. I felt like I was committing a crime, that I did something wrong and I would end up in jail. It was terrifying to live with that idea. One weekend when I was 12 or 13, some of my cousins and aunt and uncle came to visit. And it all changed when family was around. I remember one day we were outside playing and there was this boy that caught my eye. I had a crush on him, and I think he had a crush on me too. We sat down talking, and things led up to another, and we started kissing. That was my first kiss. It felt funny, but it felt good at the same time. The butterflies were like a good, nervous feeling. There was a lot of things in my life that weren't normal, but that felt normal and okay. I didn't realize that my cousin was watching, or she could even see us kissing.
I'm telling.
I pushed him away, and just all of a sudden I hear her screaming, "You're kissing a boy. I'm gonna go and tell." And I was like begging her not to tell my Aunt Laura and Uncle Chevo that I was kissing this boy because I would get in serious trouble. I started crying because I knew I was gonna get in trouble and maybe get a spanking. She didn't understand how severe my punishment was gonna be. I walked in and I remember seeing everybody in the living room. The look on my uncle's face when I got into the house, he looked very pissed off. Like his face was red in anger. It was the first time I've seen him that mad. I remember seeing my Uncle Chevel with the belt. The only thing I remember him saying was to put my hands on the couch. My Uncle Chevel took the beating way too far. In that moment, I did feel like it was very severe. The spanking stopped because somebody told him to stop hitting me, that was enough. At that moment, I thanked God that there was other people around to have him stop because I didn't think he would stop spanking me. Looking back now, I feel like his anger was coming from jealousy. I feel that he was jealous that I was kissing this boy and maybe not him. After that day, I knew that it was not going to be okay for me to be doing normal things like other kids. I wasn't able to have a normal childhood because my Uncle Chevel wanted me for himself, and that wasn't normal. I had a best friend, and we were inseparable. We were like sisters, pretty much. I always went to her house because it felt safe, and I didn't want her to go to my house. So I kind of kept her away on purpose from my house. I trusted her enough to tell her the truth. So that's what led me up to tell her.
I have to tell you something, but you promised not to say.
We're sitting together, and that's when I just told her the secret. She looked scared and said that wasn't right and it shouldn't be happening, so we should tell somebody, like her mom.
You can't.
I told her in tears that we can't tell nobody what's going on. And she just kept saying, no, we have to. It was very scary for me.
You have to say something.
I didn't want to get in trouble if they found out I told the secret. And then she finally said, okay, I promise I won't tell nobody. So I thought she kept that secret. My friend told her mom my secret. The mom reported it to Child Protective Services.
Why don't you start packing, sweetie?
They didn't say where we're going. They just said we're leaving and we need to leave by tonight. So we did as we were told. There was no explanation on why or where we were going at all. And we moved from there. And I never got to see her again. I understand why she told her mom my secret. She was just trying to get me some help to maybe stop it, and that's what I wanted, was for it to stop. After that, what had kept me from telling anyone at school, teachers, friends, was that CPS would end up telling my aunt and uncle, and we would move again. I felt ashamed. I was so embarrassed about what was going on. There was so many things I was afraid of to tell anybody. It was easier for me just to keep silent. was one time that my aunt and uncle wanted to have a conversation. I was already in high school at that time.
Abby, come sit.
I remember my uncle looking serious. They both were serious. They had that look.
Is everything okay?
They told me I wasn't in trouble. We were just gonna have a conversation. The conversation started that I was going to have their baby because my aunt wasn't able to have kids. And I looked at her like if they were crazy. My jaw dropped and I was shocked. I didn't know what to think of that they want a teenager to have a baby for them. It was very shocking.
You can't do this.
I told her, you're effing crazy. I'm not gonna have a baby. Like, I'm still in high school. So I told her no, that I didn't want to. And they were like, yes, there's no saying no, there's no debate. That's in the conversation. There was like nothing I could do to stop it. I didn't feel like my body was mine. I felt like it was theirs. This was the moment when I realized that my aunt was just as evil as my uncle. And in my eyes, I felt they were both monsters. And I cried most of the day. And I talked to myself and told myself, like, how is this happening? Why is this happening? Looking back now, I think that she knew and was aware of everything that was happening with him and me. And she chose to ignore it because she didn't want to lose my uncle's love. That makes her a monster. When I was pregnant, I did have a lot of feelings. I didn't want to be on earth no more. I was very depressed, just wanted to be alone. My uncle had threatened me about if I told anybody that I would go to jail and the baby would end up in foster care. It was hard to hide the truth. If it came up, then I had to lie and say that I messed around with some other kid, you know, from school or whatever. And I knew that was a lie. When I was going into labor, I was told not to tell anybody. They demanded it from me. So I didn't tell anybody, but I did want to. But my aunt and uncle were in the room the whole time. And when I was able to hold my newborn, I felt happy. It felt amazing to hold my baby in my hands. I felt like I was on top of the world. I was able to hold her until the nurses walked out. Then my aunt ended up grabbing her. She took her and said that this is my baby. She'll be calling you sister when she grows up. I felt like I wasn't even there. Felt really lost and used. They used me. At that time, I was taking care of the kids and my aunt and uncle, and doing all the household chores. It was like if I was a maid or a slave in my own house. And eventually it got worse. My aunt and uncle started making me do a ritual every night. I remember having to massage my aunt and uncle every night, that my hands would cramp up and I would get so uncomfortable and want to stop, but I wasn't able to. I felt on edge every night because it turned into something sexual with both of them. I felt like I was a sex slave to my aunt and uncle. I felt trapped, like I wasn't gonna be able to get out or be a part of the real world. I never left the house unless it was with the family. I felt so scared. And this went on for years. Years. It got to me, but I was thinking about the kids. I didn't want to get separated from them or end up in jail and them in foster care like I did. Running away wasn't something I thought about because I was being brainwashed. My uncle was putting things in my head, and I was believing them, and it just felt like I didn't have a mind of my own. Looking back, I wish I had run away. In this picture, it's me, my Aunt Laura, and my 3 kids. I was roughly 20 years old in this picture. Just seeing her and her holding my kids. I was an outsider to them. I wasn't their mom. She was. And that's what this picture shows. It was hard for me to smile for any photo. I forced myself to make it seem that nothing was going on, hoping that one day I would get out for everyone. My uncle had explained to me what would happen if I was to tell anybody, and his explanation was that he was going to kill me and the kids. He would slice our throats while we were sleeping. And I do believe he was capable of that. He was trying to scare me and not to telling anybody, and it worked. My aunt and uncle were religious. They were Catholics, so I was raised to say the rosary, and we went to Catholic church every Sunday. As my daughter was growing up, my aunt and uncle decided that she was a healer and she could perform miracles. It sounded really crazy to me. It did. I didn't know what she was talking about. My aunt and uncle put it out on Facebook. It got so big, my daughter wound up on the news.
Some believe God and the Virgen de Guadalupe has given Paige the gift of healing.
This is a plan he has for her, and the faith that she has in God.
People say, oh, the miracle child. She's not the miracle child. It's not her. It's just, she's God's vessel.
And just as quickly, we're reminded she's still a child.
Mommy, what's a vessel?
A boat.
It's heartbreaking to me to hear my daughter call her mommy. I haven't heard it in so long. And seeing how young my daughter was and seeing what she was doing made it so hard for me to see it again, because she would do that at least 6 to 7 hours a day. She was so innocent. She was being used into luring people in and getting their money. And I feel sorry for my daughter too, because she had to go through that. The people that were coming were ill and they wanted to be healed. But in reality, it wasn't real. She lured people in and she was really good at it. It was all just a scam, just to get their money. This is a picture of me and Rudy having dinner for, I believe it was his birthday. When me and Rudy were hiding our relationship from my aunt and uncle, I would wait till they left to work and I would take the kids to school and he would meet me down the street. Talking to him made me feel so safe. I wasn't used to it because I was not around safe men like Rudy. He just seemed very different and nice, sweet man. This was the guy that was gonna help me out through the hell I was living in. I had told him one time that there was a secret that I was holding in from him. And then I finally told him what was going on. And he said he wanted to help me and my kids get out of there because that wasn't right. He was very angry. But I told him there's nothing that I could do because if he was to get involved or if I was to leave, they would find me and kill us all. When my uncle found out about me and Rudy, he lost his mind and grabbed a gasoline. He started pouring the gasoline around the house and yelling that I was a whore and a slut. And he was gonna burn us all if I didn't do what was told of me. If you don't stop seeing Rudy, I'm gonna burn this house down and nobody will be able to see you or the kids anymore. I felt like my uncle was psychotic. It was just crazy. In that moment, I believed he can do it, and he would. My aunt was able to calm him down and take him inside. After that, I knew I had to find a way to escape and protect my children. I was not safe in that house. My uncle needed to be in a mental house. It was cruel and evil. I was done being in there. I believed that my kids and myself were in danger. So I told Rudy, enough is enough. I'm done. I want to get out of here. My aunt and uncle were at work and he told me, be ready. And that's what I did. I ended up getting a pair of clothes for me and maybe 2 to 3 pairs of clothes for my kids. And that's all I left with. I was scared for my life and Rudy's life and everybody's life in that house. I was worried that my uncle was gonna find out and come after me. I never knew if my uncle was planning to show up and kill us. I held this secret in for so long that when I finally went to the police department to tell my secret, I was terrified. I was afraid that they wouldn't believe me. I was shaking in fear because I didn't know what was gonna happen. I didn't know if I was gonna get in trouble as well. I was still in that mindset that my uncle told me I would go to jail too. All of those years that my uncle put all of those thoughts in my head were still in my mind. After telling the cops, I realized that he had been lying to me and was wrong. I cried in disbelief. It was finally over. I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. And I still couldn't believe it until we went to trial and actually saw them in their orange suits with their handcuffs on. Seeing him like that in court made me realize that he wasn't powerful, that he wasn't gonna make nobody hurt no more. The prosecutor had asked me if I wanted to do an impact statement. I wanted them to hear from my voice. This is my impact statement to my Uncle Chevel. You were supposed to be my guardian and my father, to raise me and to take care of me, to love me, but yet you did the opposite. You took my childhood away from me. Chevel, you tormented me and tortured me for more than a decade. You are a monster. You will not hurt me or my 2 beautiful, wonderful daughters and anyone else innocent. I'm sorry. And take anyone else's innocent away from them. The punishment you receive today is the punishment you deserve for being so evil. It was hard to read this in the courtroom because I was face to face with him. And the coward that he is couldn't even look up and acknowledge that I was there, but I was fine with it. It just felt like I needed to tell him these words and let him know what he was. It helped me cope just a tiny bit, just to let him know he was a monster, he was a coward, and that he wasn't gonna do this to anybody else. And he got what he deserved. When I heard their sentences, I felt like I got my justice. But he didn't spend that much time in prison because he died. I was pissed off, because I wanted him to suffer longer, like he made me suffer all these years. I was always taught to forgive, but don't forget, because God sees that. I forgive these evil people. I'm healing myself for forgiving them. It's for me to let go of everything that they have done to me. Rudy gave me the courage to start fighting again. It brought a light to my life, and knowing that there was something to fight for and not to give up. I feel without Rudy, I would still be there at that house with my aunt and uncle. He's been a rock for me. My brother and sister and I don't have much of a relationship anymore. And I just wish I had that with them. But now my kids and my husband are my world. I couldn't be here without them. My life now, I never thought it was possible. I never thought I would be so happy and raising my kids and teaching them right from wrong. I don't want my kids to ever think that I regretted having them. I, in a million years, will never regret having kids because I love them so much and I'll do anything for them. They help me heal. They help me be happy. I live with them. I leave the past in the past for them so I could get up and make my kids happy and my husband happy. I see people that have not told their stories, and I want them to be okay with, getting the help that they need when it's time for them to speak out. I'm very hopeful that they see this and they won't be so scared to tell the story that they went through.
He definitely aspired to be like Ted Bundy. What a mean son of a bitch. This is the face of evil right here. You're a sorry piece of and I'm glad that you can't hurt anybody anymore.
If you were to walk through the streets of Austin, Texas, today, you might notice an architectural anomaly towering high above the modern cityscape. Standing at an imposing height, these are the Moonlight Towers. To the casual observer or the passing tourist, they might seem like mere historical curiosities, antiquated relics of a bygone era of urban planning. They cast a pale, artificial glow over the city, a gentle illumination against the dark Texan sky. However, the true origin of these steel sentinels is rooted not in civic pride, but in a profound, paralyzing, and suffocating terror. They were erected a decade after one of the darkest chapters in American history, born from a desperate need to banish the shadows. The city of Austin illuminated its night sky because, in the late 19th century, the darkness had become synonymous with death. Long before the winding streets of Whitechapel in London ran red with the blood of Jack the Ripper's victims, and long before the term serial killer had even been conceptualized in the lexicons of psychology and law enforcement, a different kind of monster stalked the unpaved avenues of Austin. The year was 1884. The United States was still healing from the deep, visceral scars of the Civil War, and Texas was a place of rapid transition, balancing on the edge of the frontier and modern civilization. In this fragile equilibrium, a phantom materialized, unleashing a year-long reign of unspeakable brutality that would permanently fracture the community's sense of safety. This is the story of the Servant Girl Annihilator, a moniker penned by the famous short story writer O. Henry, who was living in the city at the time and witnessed the hysteria firsthand. Also known as the Austin Axe murders, this case stands as the very first recorded serial killer crisis in the history of the United States, a grim precedent that history has often overshadowed, but which those who lived through it could never forget. To understand the sheer magnitude of the panic that gripped Austin between December 1884 and December 1885, one must first understand the complete vulnerability of the era. This was a time entirely devoid of the forensic science we rely upon today. There was no deoxyribonucleic acid testing, no blood type profiling, no secure crime scene perimeters, and not even the basic understanding of fingerprint identification. Law enforcement officers of the late 19th century were equipped with little more than their instincts, crude investigative techniques, and the lanterns they carried into the pitch-black night. When a crime occurred, justice relied on eyewitness testimonies, obvious motives, and catching the perpetrator in the act. But the entity that terrorized Austin offered no such conveniences. This killer operated with a terrifying, almost supernatural stealth, moving through the sleeping city like a ghost, completely untethered from the conventional motives of robbery or personal vendetta. The terror began precisely as the year 1884 was drawing to a close. The community was entirely unaware that a countdown to devastation had commenced. The predator's methodology was as specific as it was gruesome. The targets were initially drawn from a highly vulnerable and frequently marginalized segment of society, Black women working as domestic servants, maids, and cooks. These women often resided in small, sparsely secured quarters at the rear of their employers' properties, making them tragically accessible to a nocturnal intruder. The killer demonstrated a chilling pattern, waiting patiently for the cloak of absolute night. In an era before pervasive street lighting, the darkness of Austin was absolute, save for the cyclical illumination of the moon. It was this lunar cycle that became the most terrifying timepiece the city had ever known. A distinct and horrifying correlation began to emerge. The attacks almost always coincided with the full moon or the nights immediately preceding and following it. While the bright moonlight might have logically deterred a criminal seeking concealment, for this killer, the celestial glow seemed to act as a beacon, a spotlight illuminating the path to his victims. Families across the city soon learned to dread the waxing moon, watching its progression across the sky with a mounting sense of dread, knowing that as it reached its peak brightness, the phantom would inevitably return to claim another life. The psychological warfare waged by the killer was perhaps just as devastating as the physical violence. The attack struck at the very heart of human security, the sanctuary of sleep. The perpetrator would silently breach the domestic threshold, slipping through unlocked doors or quietly prying open windows. There was no forced entry that would shatter the silence and awaken the neighborhood. Instead, the killer would navigate the dark interiors with predatory grace, locating the sleeping women in their beds. What followed was a ritual of profound degradation and violence. The victims were violently roused from their slumber and forcibly dragged from their beds, pulled out of their homes, and hauled into the harsh, cold exposure of the dark yards, back gardens, or unlit alleyways. Once outside, the phantom unleashed a level of savagery that left hardened police officers and morticians deeply traumatized. The killer did not utilize firearms, which would have alerted the neighbors and the primitive night patrols. Instead, he favored the brutal, intimate violence of heavy, sharp implements. Axes, large hunting knives, iron spikes, and heavy metal rods were the tools of his macabre trade. The trauma inflicted upon the victims was concentrated almost entirely on the head and the chest, delivered with such ferocity that it indicated a deep, uncontrollable rage. In a final, chilling signature that taunted the baffled police force, the killer would almost always abandon the murder weapon at the crime scene or casually discard it nearby. It was an arrogant declaration of invincibility, a statement that he did not fear apprehension, and a physical reminder of the brutal force he wielded. As the body count began to rise, starting with the brutal slaying of Molly Smith in late December 1884, the initial shock within the community quickly metastasized into a pervasive, suffocating hysteria. By the spring of 1885, as more women met the same horrific fate, the atmosphere in Austin became toxic with paranoia. The realization that a serial murderer was operating in their midst, slaughtering women with impunity, broke the psychological foundation of the city. No one felt safe. The socioeconomic and racial boundaries that typically divided the city began to blur under the universal threat of the axe. The immediate reaction of the populace was a desperate scramble for self-preservation. Businesses in Austin experienced an unprecedented economic boom in the commerce of fear. The sales of revolvers, rifles, and ammunition skyrocketed, stripping the shelves of local mercantile stores bare. Blacksmiths and carpenters worked continuously, forging heavy iron deadbolts, window bars, and intricate locking mechanisms for terrified homeowners who suddenly viewed their wooden doors as dangerously inadequate. The demand for guard dogs surged, with any canine capable of barking at a shadow being brought inside to serve as an early warning system. As the sun began to set each evening, a profound silence would fall over Austin. The streets, normally bustling with the evening activities of a growing city, would empty rapidly. Citizens barricaded themselves indoors, sitting in dimly lit parlors with loaded firearms resting across their laps, straining to hear the sound of footsteps on the porch or the agonizing creak of a window pane being lifted. The desperation of the citizens was mirrored by the frantic and largely ineffective response of the local law enforcement. The Austin police force was entirely overwhelmed by the sophistication and brutality of the crimes. In their desperation to restore order and present the illusion of control, they resorted to the only investigative tactics they knew, which ultimately led to a tragic compounding of injustices. Because the initial victims were predominantly Black women, the deeply entrenched prejudices of the era blinded the investigators. They operated under the assumption that the violence must be internal to the victim's community. The police systematically targeted the husbands, boyfriends, and male acquaintances of the deceased women. Dozens of innocent men were violently dragged from their homes, interrogated under brutal conditions, and thrown into jail cells based on nothing more than circumstantial proximity to the victims and the color of their skin. Law enforcement wasted precious time and resources attempting to force confessions from grieving men who had just lost their loved ones to a monster. Yet, time and time again, the police were forced to release these suspects. The reason was as undeniable as it was terrifying. While the supposed prime suspects were securely locked behind iron bars in the city jail, the bloodletting continued. The true killer remained perfectly free, unbothered by the dragnet, continuing to strike whenever the moon grew full. Recognizing the failure of the official police force to protect them, the citizens of Austin took the law into their own hands, organizing immense, citywide public night patrols. Men from all walks of life banded together, forming vigilante committees that marched through the darkened streets from dusk until dawn. They carried lanterns, shotguns, and makeshift weapons, sweeping through alleyways and peering into shadows, determined to catch the elusive butcher in the act. The city was practically under martial law of its own making. Yet, incredibly, this massive mobilization of armed citizens proved utterly futile. The killer possessed an uncanny, almost preternatural ability to evade detection. He moved through the heavily patrolled grid of Austin like a shadow detaching itself from the night, slipping past armed guards, silently breaching heavily fortified homes, committing his horrific acts in the yards, and vanishing back into the ether before a single alarm could be raised. This environment of extreme dread set the stage for a dramatic escalation. For months, the wealthy, white establishment of Austin had viewed the murders with a mixture of horror and detached sympathy, believing the carnage was somehow confined to the domestic servant class. But the phantom in the night was not bound by the societal structures of 19th-century Texas. As the year progressed toward its grim conclusion, the killer would shift his focus, crossing the invisible lines of class and race, and bringing the terror directly into the opulent bedrooms of the city's most affluent families. The realization that absolute wealth, social standing, and heavy wooden doors offered zero protection against the annihilator would push the city of Austin to the very brink of complete psychological collapse, setting the stage for a series of crimes that would cement this unknown figure as the most feared entity in the history of the American frontier. To truly comprehend the terror that saturated the atmosphere of Austin during this harrowing year, one must first understand the fragile existence of the people who were hunted. The victims of this unseen predator were not random casualties in a chaotic city, but rather individuals occupying a very specific, deeply vulnerable intersection of class, race, and geography. In the late 19th century, Austin was a rapidly developing urban center, a place where grand Victorian homes were being erected by a burgeoning class of wealthy merchants, politicians, and professionals. Yet, behind these opulent facades lay a starkly different reality. Separated by mere yards of manicured lawns or dirt pathways, the domestic servant quarters stood as fragile wooden islands of isolation. These small, poorly constructed shacks and outbuildings were entirely detached from the main houses they served. They lacked heavy locks, sturdy doors, or any semblance of structural security. It was within these flimsy wooden walls that the black women who formed the backbone of the city's domestic workforce lived, rested, and ultimately waited in the dark. These women were the invisible engine of Austin society. They were the cooks who rose before the sun to heat the stoves, the maids who scrubbed the floors until their hands were raw, and the laundresses who labored over boiling vats of water. After grueling days of physical exertion, they would retreat to their solitary quarters at the back of the property, seeking nothing more than the restorative embrace of sleep. They were isolated from the protection of their own communities, living on the very properties of their employers, yet entirely segregated from the safety afforded to those residing in the main house. The killer understood this architectural and social vulnerability perfectly. He knew that a scream echoing from a servant shack in the dead of night might be ignored, dismissed, or heard too late by the wealthy families sleeping in their fortified mansions just a few dozen feet away. The tragedy commenced on the 30th of December, 1884, shattering the winter silence and introducing a level of barbarity the city had never witnessed. The first known victim was Molly Smith, a 30-year-old woman employed as a cook. Molly lived in a small, modest room positioned at the rear of her employer's residence. As the freezing December night enveloped the city, Molly retired to her bed, entirely unaware that the darkness outside her thin walls was harboring a monster. The exact sequence of events remains lost to the shadows, but the aftermath spoke volumes of the assailant's absolute ruthlessness. The killer breached her fragile sanctuary with terrifying ease, attacking Molly while she lay vulnerable in her bed. He wielded an axe with devastating force, striking her with a venomous anger that defied all logic. But the horror did not end within the confines of her room. In a display of physical dominance and chilling ritualism that would soon become his signature, the attacker dragged her bleeding body out of the bed, out of the small house, and into the freezing exposure of the backyard. When her remains were discovered, the brutality of the scene left investigators speechless. The murder weapon, a heavy axe covered in the evidence of his crime, was casually discarded nearby, a silent taunt to the authorities and a horrifying promise to the city. For a brief period, the authorities and the citizens of Austin attempted to rationalize the murder of Molly Smith as a tragic, isolated incident, perhaps the result of a personal dispute or a crime of passion. But the phantom was only resting, waiting for the celestial cycle to renew. When the spring of 1885 arrived, the violence resumed with a ferocity that eradicated any lingering hope of a solitary tragedy. On the 6th of May, a domestic servant named Eliza Shelley became the second victim. The methodology was identical, yet the application of violence seemed to escalate. The killer once again bypassed any meager security, entering her quarters under the cover of darkness. The attack was swift and catastrophic. Eliza's life was extinguished by an axe blow so immensely powerful that it literally split her head entirely in two. The sheer physical strength required to inflict such a wound terrified the investigating officers. This was not the frantic, desperate strike of a common thief. This was the deliberate, overpowering blow of someone who reveled in absolute destruction. Less than 3 weeks later, on the 22nd of May, the predator struck again, proving that his thirst for carnage was intensifying. The victim was Irene Cross, another woman trapped in the precarious existence of domestic servitude. The killer's approach to Irene demonstrated a horrifying evolution in his methods. While the previous murders were characterized by the blunt, immediate devastation of an axe, the attack on Irene Cross was protracted and deeply sadistic. She was subjected to a frenzy of violence, stabbed multiple times with a sharp implement that tore through her flesh with merciless repetition. But the most horrifying detail of Irene's demise, the detail that sent paralyzing shockwaves through the entire community and cemented the killer's reputation as an inhuman monster, was the mutilation he performed after the initial attack. The killer had taken a blade and completely scalped her. This act of profound desecration moved the crimes beyond mere murder and into the realm of psychological warfare. The citizens of Austin were no longer dealing with a killer. They were being hunted by an entity that sought to humiliate, obliterate, and completely dismantle the humanity of his victims. The summer of 1885 brought no reprieve, only a suffocating heat that seemed to mirror the rising panic within the city limits. The Black community of Austin was enduring an unimaginable trauma, living in a constant state of agonizing vigilance. Every shadow held a threat, and every rustle of the wind against a wooden wall signaled impending doom. Women went to sleep fully clothed, clutching whatever crude weapons they could find, praying that the dawn would come before the phantom did. But the killer was not satisfied with the terror he had already sown. As August drew to a close, he crossed a threshold of depravity that forever scarred the collective soul of the city. On the 30th of August, the Annihilator claimed his fourth victim, shattering the illusion that age or innocence could serve as a shield against his wrath. The victim was Mary Ramey, a child of merely 11 years old. Mary was a young Black girl whose life had barely begun, yet she was subjected to a nightmare that defies human comprehension. The predator infiltrated her home, bypassing any adults, and focused his predatory gaze on the defenseless child. In a display of overwhelming cruelty, he dragged the young girl out of her home and into a dark, unforgiving alleyway. There, hidden from the world, he subjected her to a violent sexual assault. The culmination of this horrific attack was a murder so gruesome it remains difficult to articulate. The killer did not use his customary axe. Instead, he utilized a long, heavy iron spike. With unfathomable malice, he drove this metal rod directly through the child's ear, forcing it deep into her brain. The murder of Mary Ramey completely shattered the psyche of Austin. The realization that a creature capable of inflicting such calculated, torturous agony upon an 11-year-old child was roaming their streets entirely undetected pushed the community beyond fear and into absolute, unadulterated despair. As September arrived, the citizens of Austin were entirely consumed by the crisis. The belief that having a male presence in the home could offer protection was a desperate hope many clung to. But on the 28th of September, the Annihilator deliberately destroyed that illusion as well. The killer targeted a residence where Gracie Vance and Orange Washington resided. By attacking a couple, the Phantom proved that numbers and the presence of a man were utterly inconsequential to his mission. The violence unleashed upon Gracie and Orange was chaotic, frenzied, and utterly overwhelming. The killer utilized a combination of heavy, blunt force and sharp trauma, beating them both to death with a heavy iron rod and an axe. The dual murder was a statement of supremacy. The assailant had entered a confined space containing two adults, overpowered them completely, battered them until they were unrecognizable, and vanished once again without leaving a single tangible clue behind. Throughout this agonizing 9-month period, a dark and uncomfortable truth hung over the city of Austin, a truth rooted deeply in the social architecture of the era. For the first 3/4 of a year, the victims were exclusively Black individuals, specifically women working in the lowest tiers of the social hierarchy, along with a young child and a male companion. While the entire city was deeply unsettled by the presence of a brutal murderer, the white, affluent establishment maintained a slight, almost subconscious psychological distance from the carnage. The prevailing sentiment among the wealthy elite was one of profound horror, yet it was often coupled with a misguided belief that the violence was a tragedy somehow contained within the servant class. They fortified their homes and purchased firearms, but they still believed that the deep racial and economic divides of Texas would somehow act as an invisible barrier, keeping the monster confined to the back alleys and the servant quarters. They mourned the loss of their cooks and maids, but they did not truly believe that the axe would ever strike the polished wooden doors of their own grand estates. This societal complacency, this reliance on the structural inequalities of the 19th century to serve as a buffer against absolute evil, was a tragic miscalculation. The predator who stalked the moonlit streets was not motivated by the complex racial politics of the post-Civil War South, nor was he restricted by the socio-economic boundaries that dictated the lives of the citizens. He was a force of pure, indiscriminate violence, driven by an internal compulsion that was entirely detached from the social standing of the flesh he tore apart. The first 6 victims bore the entirety of the terror, their lives extinguished in the dark margins of the city, while the authorities chased shadows and false suspects. Their tragic deaths served as the terrifying prelude to a crescendo of violence that was about to shatter the illusions of the untouched elite. The killer had spent a year honing his craft on the vulnerable and the marginalized. Now, as the winter of 1885 approached, bringing the anniversary of his first kill, the Phantom was preparing to step out of the alleyways, cross the manicured lawns, and bring his heavy, blood-soaked axe directly into the pristine, heavily guarded bedrooms of Austin's most privileged citizens. The bitter chill of late December settled over the city of Austin in 1885, bringing with it a festive season that was utterly suffocated by an atmosphere of unrelenting dread. Christmas was approaching, a time traditionally defined by warmth, familial gathering, and spiritual reflection, but the residents of the Texan capital were completely paralyzed by a completely different kind of anticipation. For 12 agonizing months, the community had endured the horrifying reality of a nocturnal predator who butchered the vulnerable domestic workers living in the fragile wooden shacks behind the grand estates. The wealthy, white establishment of the city had fortified their mansions, purchased heavily armed protection, and successfully convinced themselves that the architectural strength of their opulent homes and the inherent privilege of their social standing provided an impenetrable shield against the monster roaming their streets. They viewed the ongoing slaughter as a tragic, gruesome plague that afflicted only the marginalized, entirely failing to comprehend that absolute malice recognizes no societal boundaries. This collective delusion, born of desperation and deep-seated prejudice, was destined to be violently shattered on the very night the city was supposed to be celebrating the eve of Christmas. The Phantom, having spent a year perfecting his methods of silent infiltration and absolute destruction within the dark margins of the city, was now prepared to elevate his campaign of terror. He was ready to cross the manicured lawns, bypass the heavy iron locks, and demonstrate to the affluent citizens of Austin that their perceived sanctuary was nothing more than an illusion. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the 24th of December, an eerie silence fell over the unpaved streets of the capital. The moon, hanging heavy and bright in the winter sky, cast long, sinister shadows across the grand Victorian facades. In one of these substantial, well-appointed homes lived Susan Hancock, a respectable, affluent white woman whose life was the absolute antithesis of the marginalized servants who had perished before her. Her residence was regarded as a fortress of middle-class security, built with thick wooden doors, heavy window panes, and situated in a neighborhood that felt entirely insulated from the brutality of the alleyways. Susan retired to her bed that evening with a reasonable expectation of safety, likely believing that the heavily armed night patrols wandering the city limits and the solid construction of her home were sufficient to keep the darkness at bay. She was entirely unaware that the predator was already navigating the freezing night, moving with a silent, ghostly precision that completely evaded the frantic, heavily armed vigilantes. The killer did not see a wealthy socialite. He merely saw another target illuminated by the pale moonlight, another opportunity to exercise his profound, insatiable compulsion for violence. The precise method by which the Annihilator breached the Hancock residence remains a chilling testament to his predatory skill. Despite the locks and the pervasive paranoia gripping the city, he managed to slip inside the house without triggering a single alarm, navigating the dark, unfamiliar corridors with an unnatural ease. When he reached Susan Hancock, the violence he unleashed was swift, catastrophic, and completely identical to the butchery he had inflicted upon the servant girls. The illusion of aristocratic immunity was instantly eradicated by the swing of a heavy, rusted axe. Susan was struck in the head with an immense, terrifying force, a blow designed to completely obliterate rather than merely kill. But the assailant was not satisfied with the blunt devastation of the axe. In a display of profound, sadistic malice, he produced a sharp, piercing implement and drove it violently directly through her heart. The psychological implications of this specific methodology were staggering. The killer was not just taking a life. He was engaging in a ritualistic dismantling of the human body, combining the heavy, crushing trauma of the axe with the intimate, focused penetration of a blade. When the horrifying discovery was made, the realization that a prominent white woman had been slaughtered in her own bed, subjected to the exact same modus operandi as the murdered black servants, sent an unprecedented shockwave of pure, unadulterated terror through the highest echelons of Austin society. However, the nightmare of that Christmas Eve was far from over. The most terrifying aspect of the Annihilator was not merely his brutality, but his insatiable stamina and his supreme arrogance. While the authorities were likely just beginning to comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy at the Hancock residence, the primitive nature of law enforcement communication in 1885 meant that the rest of the city remained completely oblivious to the fresh carnage. There were no radios, no rapid dispatch systems, only the frantic shouts of terrified neighbors and the swinging lanterns of policemen running through the freezing mud. Amidst this chaotic, localized confusion, the Phantom was still actively hunting. He had not retreated into the shadows to hide. Instead, he was traversing the freezing city streets under the bright moonlight, seeking to compound the horror before the sun could rise. Only a few hours after he had cleaved the skull and pierced the heart of Susan Hancock, the killer targeted another prominent household. The target this time was Eula Phillips, another affluent, married white woman living in a completely different neighborhood. The sheer logistical audacity of committing two highly brutal, incredibly messy, and intimately violent murders in separate locations within the span of a single night, while the entire city was practically under a self-imposed martial law with heavily armed men patrolling every major intersection, completely defied the comprehension of law enforcement. It suggested an adversary who was not only physically powerful and deeply deranged, but also incredibly organized, supremely confident, and intimately familiar with the geography, the patrol routes, and the blind spots of the city. He moved not like a frantic fugitive, but like an apex predator entirely in control of his domain. The infiltration of the Phillips residence mirrored the silent, terrifying efficiency of the earlier attack. The killer slipped past whatever defenses were in place, entering the domain of Eula Phillips with the same deadly intent. But the horror inflicted upon Eula was compounded by an escalation in the killer's sadistic desires. He dragged her from the supposed safety of her bedroom, hauling her out into the freezing, unforgiving exposure of the night, a signature move that he had previously reserved for the servant women in the back alleys. Once outside, isolated from any immediate intervention, the killer subjected her to a violent and deeply traumatizing sexual assault. This ultimate violation was then followed by the catastrophic, blunt force trauma that had become his terrifying calling card. Eula Phillips was brutally struck down with a heavy axe, the sheer physical force of the blows echoing the immense, uncontainable rage that fueled the perpetrator. And, exactly as he had done in the past, the killer simply abandoned his heavy, blood-soaked weapon at the scene of the crime. Leaving the axe behind was a profound psychological gesture. It was a taunt aimed directly at the armed patrols, the baffled police force, and the terrified citizenry. It was a way of silently communicating that he did not need to hide his weapons because he was entirely beyond their reach, a phantom who could slaughter at will and vanish back into the cold night without leaving a single trace of his own identity behind. When the dawn finally broke on Christmas Day, the sun illuminated a city that had been completely and fundamentally broken. The festive holiday was entirely forgotten, replaced by a scene of apocalyptic mourning and paralyzing panic. Church bells that were meant to ring in celebration instead tolled like mournful alarms, their heavy chimes carrying the devastating news across the morning frost. The news of the dual murders swept through the unpaved streets like a wildfire, carrying with it the undeniable realization that the rules of engagement had entirely changed. The fragile barrier of class and race that the wealthy elite had clung to for 12 months had been violently dismantled overnight. The blood of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that heavy doors, substantial wealth, and prominent social standing offered absolutely zero protection against the monster that stalked their city. The Annihilator had demonstrated that he could enter any home, overpower any victim, and execute his gruesome rituals with complete impunity. The citizens of Austin were no longer dealing with a localized threat confined to the margins of society. They were trapped in a citywide nightmare where absolutely anyone could be the next target on the killer's list. Law enforcement was completely paralyzed, staring at two fresh, horrifyingly violent crime scenes in affluent neighborhoods, realizing that their previous theories, their mass arrests of innocent men, and their exhausting vigilante patrols had been entirely useless. The police department was exposed as profoundly inadequate, leaving the citizens feeling entirely abandoned to a monstrous fate. The psychological devastation inflicted upon the community on that single night was unprecedented in the history of the American frontier. Husbands looked at their wives with profound terror, knowing that their presence in the home, their loaded rifles, and their locked doors had not saved the women who perished just hours before. The full moon, which had already become a recognized symbol of impending doom, was now viewed with an almost supernatural dread. It was a cruel irony that the very light the citizens relied upon to pierce the darkness and spot the intruder was the exact same illumination the killer used to navigate their streets and select his prey. The city of Austin was completely consumed by a suffocating hysteria, a collective trauma that fundamentally altered the behavior and the psyche of every single resident. People entirely abandoned their own homes, seeking refuge in large, heavily armed groups huddled together in boarding houses or the reinforced mansions of their neighbors, boarding up windows not just with wood, but with heavy iron grates and makeshift barricades. The terrifying reality that a single human being could commit such unspeakable atrocities, brutalizing two entirely separate women in completely different parts of the city within a matter of hours, pushed the limits of human understanding and sanity. The Austin Axe murders had reached their terrifying crescendo, transforming the bustling, ambitious Texan capital into an apocalyptic landscape of absolute dread, a place where the shadows held the very real promise of a violent, agonizing death, and where the authorities were entirely powerless to stop the slaughter. The horrific events of that Christmas Eve would ensure that the Phantom would never be forgotten, cementing his legacy as a harbinger of absolute destruction and changing the fabric of the city forever. The Austin Police Department in the immediate aftermath of the Christmas Eve massacre was a portrait of utter, paralyzing despair. The stifling air inside the precinct was thick with the acrid smoke of cheap cigars, stale sweat, and the palpable, suffocating weight of insurmountable failure. Law enforcement in the late 19th century was a rugged, rudimentary institution, completely unequipped to handle the psychological complexity and the absolute physical devastation of a serial predator. To truly understand the impossible task these investigators faced, one must completely strip away every modern preconceived notion of criminal justice. There were no crime scene perimeters secured by bright yellow tape. There were no forensic technicians meticulously gathering microscopic fibers or dusting the heavy wooden doors for latent prints. The foundational science of fingerprint identification, which would eventually revolutionize policing across the globe, was still in its absolute infancy, completely unknown and unutilized by the overwhelmed officers in Texas. The concept of blood type profiling, let alone the miraculous sequencing of deoxyribonucleic acid, belonged to a distant, unimaginable future. When an investigator in 1885 walked into a room heavily painted with the horrific aftermath of an axe attack, they were armed with nothing more than their naked eyes, their fragile human intuition, and a flickering lantern. They could stare at a blood-soaked weapon abandoned in the dirt for hours, but the heavy iron and splintered would remain completely mute, offering absolutely zero scientific testimony about the monster who had swung it. Forced to navigate this profound darkness without a scientific compass, the police resorted to a sprawling, chaotic, and deeply flawed dragnet. Over the course of the year, authorities hauled more than 400 individuals into their cramped interrogation rooms. It was an astonishing number for a city of that size, reflecting a desperate, almost feral panic to cage a phantom. But this frantic sweep was heavily poisoned by the deeply entrenched prejudices of the era. Because the first 6 victims were Black women and their companions, the predominantly white police force operated under a rigid, discriminatory assumption that the violence must be a localized, internal issue within the marginalized community. They fundamentally failed to recognize the signature of a singular, psychopathic entity, choosing instead to view the early murders as a string of excessively violent domestic disputes. Consequently, the initial phases of the investigation became a secondary source of profound trauma for the grieving families. Husbands, boyfriends, and casual male acquaintances of the deceased women were violently apprehended, dragged from their mourning, and subjected to grueling, brutal interrogations. These innocent men, already shattered by the gruesome loss of their loved ones, were aggressively pressured to confess to monstrous acts they could not even comprehend. The police locked dozens of these men behind heavy iron bars, briefly declaring victory to a terrified public, only to be utterly humiliated when the next full moon rose and another innocent woman was butchered while their prime suspects sat securely in a prison cell. The shattering of this racially biased paradigm on Christmas Eve, when the affluent, white Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips were slaughtered in their own pristine bedrooms, forced the police into a state of severe cognitive dissonance. The undeniable reality was that a singular, unstoppable force was ravaging their city across all societal boundaries. Yet, instead of accepting their catastrophic failure to identify the serial nature of the crimes earlier, the investigators pivoted to another deeply flawed, entirely desperate theory. They attempted to mentally separate the atrocities, desperate to convince themselves and the panicked public that the murders of the wealthy white women were somehow unconnected to the slaughter of the Black servants. This profound denial led the authorities to focus their investigative gaze directly onto the grieving husbands of the final 2 victims, James Phillips and John Hancock. The logic employed by the desperate detectives was a tragic misinterpretation of circumstance. They argued that a husband might use the ongoing panic of the servant girl murders as a convenient, horrific camouflage to eliminate his own wife and escape justice. The authorities arrested both James Phillips and John Hancock, throwing 2 prominent members of Austin society into the very same chaotic justice system that had previously tormented the marginalized community. The investigators deliberately ignored the absolute, undeniable uniformity of the crime scenes. The silent infiltration, the dragging of the victims into the freezing night, the catastrophic blunt force trauma to the skull, the profound mutilation, and the arrogant abandonment of the heavy murder weapons were all perfectly, horrifyingly identical to the previous 6 murders. Yet, blinded by their own desperation to close the most high-profile cases, the police relentlessly pursued the husbands, entirely wasting precious time while the true architect of the massacre remained completely invisible. Despite the agonizing missteps, the labyrinthine investigation did occasionally brush against the edges of a terrifying truth, producing a suspect who remains, to this day, the most compelling physical manifestation of the Annihilator. Amidst the hundreds of falsely accused men, the name Nathan Elgin emerged from the shadows. Elgin was a 19-year-old Black man who worked in a local slaughterhouse as a butcher. At first glance, he might have seemed like just another face caught in the relentless police dragnet, but a closer examination of his life and his physical attributes painted a profoundly disturbing portrait. By trade, Elgin was a man intimately familiar with the anatomy of flesh and bone. He spent his days wielding heavy cleavers, sharp knives, and heavy axes, acquiring the exact type of physical strength, callousness to blood, and brutal efficiency that the killer demonstrated at every single crime scene. The horrific, overpowering blows that cleaved the skulls of the victims required an immense, practiced strength, a strength that a young, physically imposing butcher would possess in terrifying abundance. But the most chilling piece of circumstantial evidence connecting Elgin to the dark alleys of Austin was a physical deformity. At several of the muddy, blood-soaked crime scenes, investigators had managed to identify a very specific, deeply unsettling clue left in the dirt. Beside the mutilated bodies, they found the distinct impression of a barefoot man who was missing a toe on his right foot. It was a minuscule detail in a sea of chaos, but it was a detail that matched Nathan Elgin perfectly. He was, in fact, missing a toe, an injury that would have produced the exact, unusual footprint found near the discarded weapons. The climax of Nathan Elgin's story, and perhaps the climax of the entire terrifying saga, occurred in the early, freezing months of 1886, shortly after the Christmas Eve massacre had pushed the city to the absolute brink of madness. Elgin was involved in a chaotic, intensely violent altercation at a local saloon. In a sudden, explosive fit of rage that mirrored the uncontrollable frenzy of the Annihilator, he drew a large knife and viciously attacked a woman. The screaming and the chaos drew the immediate attention of a nearby police officer. Recognizing the imminent, lethal threat Elgin posed to the screaming woman, the officer drew his service weapon and fired. Nathan Elgin was shot and succumbed to his catastrophic injuries shortly thereafter. What followed his violent death was not a grand revelation or a definitive confession, but rather an absolute, deafening silence. The terrifying cycle of the moon no longer brought the promise of slaughter. The bloody axes were no longer found abandoned in the backyard gardens. The sudden, absolute cessation of the Austin axe murders immediately following the fatal shooting of a 19-year-old butcher who possessed the precise physical skills, the necessary aggressive pathology, and the exact physical deformity found at the crime scenes remains the most compelling, haunting piece of circumstantial closure the city ever received. Yet, the human mind struggles to accept that such a monumental, historic evil could be so quietly, almost accidentally extinguished in a random barroom scuffle. The sheer scale of the terror inspired alternative theories that stretched far beyond the borders of Texas, weaving the tragedy of Austin into the fabric of a global nightmare. Decades after the blood had dried in the unpaved streets, a terrifying hypothesis emerged from the meticulous research of historical investigators like Shirley Rives. They looked at the timeline of the Austin atrocities, which abruptly and inexplicably ceased at the end of 1885, and they looked across the Atlantic Ocean to the dense, fog-choked streets of Whitechapel in London. Approximately 3 years later, in the autumn of 1888, the world would be introduced to Jack the Ripper, a phantom who stalked the night, targeting vulnerable women, butchering them with a horrifying, surgical precision, and vanishing into the mist without a trace. The transatlantic theory suggests a deeply unsettling possibility. What if the Annihilator did not die in a Texas saloon? What if the killer was an itinerant worker, a merchant sailor, or a transient labor utilizing the rapidly expanding global network of rail and port systems? The psychological profile of the two phantoms is undeniably, chillingly similar. Both predators harbored a profound, psychotic hatred for women. Both operated exclusively under the cover of absolute darkness. Both exhibited a terrifying level of anatomical desecration, and both possessed the uncanny, almost supernatural ability to completely evade heavy police patrols in densely populated urban environments. While Jack the Ripper favored the silent, intimate slice of a blade over the crushing, heavy blow of an axe, the underlying sadistic compulsion to completely obliterate the female form remains a deeply disturbing parallel. There is absolutely zero physical evidence, no ship manifests or passenger logs, to definitively place the Austin killer on a boat to England. It remains a ghost story built entirely on the fragile architecture of coincidence and the undeniable similarities in their monstrous methodologies. But as the desperate detectives in 1885 stared at their silent, blood-stained evidence, they could never have imagined that the terrifying shadow that slipped through their fingers might have eventually cast its long, dark silhouette over the cobblestones of London, ensuring that the true identity of the monster would remain eternally lost to the relentless march of history. The icy dawn that followed the Christmas Eve massacre not only illuminated a city shattered by terror, but also laid bare the desperate incompetence of a justice system pushed to its breaking point. Austin authorities, facing the total collapse of their credibility and the uncontrollable panic of a population on the brink of insurrection, desperately needed a culprit. Unable to grasp the elusive phantom that crept into homes with the fluidity of a shadow, investigators chose the path of least resistance, a road paved with illusions and blind prejudice. In a monumental act of denial, they willfully ignored the glaring and undeniable similarities between the murders of the African-American maids and the brutal massacre of the wealthy white women. Instead of acknowledging the existence of a sadistic serial killer whose bloodlust transcended all social boundaries, the police turned to the most obvious targets, the most emotionally vulnerable. They shone the spotlight of justice on grieving husbands James Phillips and John Hancock. The arrest of these two wealthy and respected men marked the beginning of a travesty of justice, transforming the unbearable grief of two spouses into a macabre spectacle of baseless accusations. To understand the cruel absurdity of these arrests, one must delve into the psychological abyss into which James Phillips and John Hancock were suddenly thrown. These men had just suffered the ultimate trauma, discovering the mutilated and desecrated bodies of their wives in the very sanctuaries of their homes. Their lives had been shattered in the space of a few bloody hours. Yet, instead of receiving compassion and support from their community, they were dragged from their blood-soaked homes, handcuffed, and thrown into cold, damp cells. The theory put forward by law enforcement was appallingly cynical. Investigators postulated that these respectable men had taken advantage of the hysteria surrounding the maid killer to murder their own wives, using the monster's modus operandi as perfect camouflage. This hypothesis required believing that two separate men, living in different neighborhoods, had simultaneously decided, on the same Christmas night, to massacre their wives with unprecedented violence, perfectly mimicking a serial killer whose methods had terrorized the entire city for a year. It was a fractured logic, born not from a careful analysis of the evidence, but from an urgent political need to close the most high-profile cases and appease a terrified white elite. The Travis County Courthouse quickly became the epicenter of a legal drama that would captivate and divide the town. The trial of James Phillips, accused of the brutal murder of his wife Eula, was the first to begin, unfolding in an atmosphere thick with anxiety, whispers, and accusing glances. The courtroom was packed, filled with citizens whose faces still bore the marks of the night's terror. The air was heavy, stifling, thick with the desperate expectation of some kind of resolution. Prosecutors, aware of the inherent weakness of their physical evidence, compensated for this emptiness with aggressive theatrics and skillful manipulation of emotions. They painted a picture of a jealous and violent husband, weaving a web of suppositions and rumors to mask the glaring absence of any real motive. The prosecution meticulously avoided mentioning the horrors inflicted on the African-American maids in the preceding months, knowing full well that including these crimes would instantly destroy their case. They presented Eula Phillips's murder in an artificial void, deliberately ignoring the abandoned axe, the trail of blood in the yard, the sexual assault, and the catastrophic skull mutilation, all unmistakable signatures of the monster who terrorized Austin. James Phillips, sitting in the dock, presented the tragic image of a man broken by grief and incomprehension. He had to listen, day after day, as prosecutors dissected the intimate details of his marriage, distorted his actions, and tarnished the memory of the woman he loved. The defense attorneys fought fiercely against this tide of circumstantial accusations, emphasizing the physical impossibility of Phillips committing such a savage act without leaving a single trace of blood on his own clothes, and demonstrating the complete absence of a murder weapon belonging to him. They implored the jury to look beyond the courtroom walls, to remember the 6 other victims killed in the same terrifying manner, and to acknowledge the existence of the true predator who still lurked. But fear is a relentless tyrant that blinds reason. The jurors, drawn from a traumatized community desperately seeking a reassuring conclusion, were psychologically incapable of accepting that a phantom, invincible serial killer could still be at large. They needed a tangible, human monster, someone they could convict and lock behind iron bars to regain the illusion of security. The pressure on the jury was immense, reflecting the crushing burden of a city suffocating under the weight of its own paranoia. The deliberations were intense, steeped in the awareness that their decision would not only seal one man's fate, but also dictate the level of terror with which the city of Austin would go to sleep each night. When the verdict was finally delivered, it thundered through the silent courtroom. James Phillips was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his beloved wife. The sentence was harsh, reflecting the brutality of the crime he was wrongly accused of. When the verdict was announced, a wave of guilty relief swept through some of the audience. Austin's high society could finally breathe a sigh of relief, clinging desperately to the idea that the nightmare was over, that the violence had ultimately been nothing more than a series of isolated domestic tragedies, not the work of some harbinger of indiscriminate destruction. Meanwhile, James Phillips, condemned to spend the rest of his days in a dark cell for a crime he did not commit, became the tragic collateral victim of police incompetence and collective panic. However, the truth has a stubborn way of resurfacing, even when buried under mountains of denial and rigged legal proceedings. John Hancock's trial, though anticipated, began to falter under the weight of the overwhelming evidence of the husband's innocence. Phillips' defense attorneys, refusing to accept this travesty of justice, immediately launched a series of rigorous appeals. They took the case to the highest courts in the state, removing it from the poisoned and terrified atmosphere of Travis County. It was in the colder, more objective environment of the appeals courts that the reality of the facts finally began to pierce the illusion. The appeals judges, analyzing the trial transcripts without the emotional burden of impending fear, quickly identified the gaping flaws in the prosecution's case. They closely examined the lack of physical evidence, the contradictions in coerced testimony, and, most importantly, the lower court's deliberate blindness to the serial killer's obvious pattern of behavior. The appeals court was forced to confront the elephant in the room. The judges acknowledged that it was statistically and logically impossible to separate the murders of Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock from the macabre string of maid killings that had preceded them. The killer's signature, the use of an axe, the nighttime timing, the removal of the bodies from outside, the lack of forced entry, and the unprecedented violence concentrated on the head, formed a unique and undeniable behavioral fingerprint. It became painfully clear that James Phillips could not have hacked his wife to death with an axe, dragged her into the yard, and mutilated her, all while perfectly mimicking a ghost killer, without being covered in blood or leaving behind incriminating evidence. Faced with this inescapable conclusion, the justice system had to admit its monumental failure. James Phillips' conviction was officially and definitively overturned, the charges against him having been deemed entirely without factual basis. In the wake of this landmark decision, the charges against John Hancock were also dropped, with prosecutors silently acknowledging the collapse of their absurd copycat murder theory. The release of James Phillips and John Hancock, however, offered no true catharsis, neither for the wrongfully accused men nor for the city of Austin. They walked out of prison as free men in the eyes of the law, but their lives were irrevocably shattered. They carried the eternal burden of grief for their murdered wives, a grief that had been desecrated by the horrific accusations of the police and the suspicious glances of a judgmental community. The stain of the murder accusation, though erased from the legal records, remained etched in the city's collective memory, forever isolating them in a purgatory of whispers and averted glances. They were the surviving victims of a multifaceted tragedy, crushed by both the senseless cruelty of a serial killer and the ruthless injustice of a system desperately seeking a scapegoat. For the citizens of Austin, the overturning of the verdict was like a cold shower, instantly reigniting the flames of terror they thought had been extinguished. The terrifying realization hit the city with the force of an axe. If the husbands were not the murderers, it meant only one thing, a truth so appalling that many had refused to contemplate it. The monster was still there. The true handmade annihilator, the sadistic predator who had slaughtered 8 people and maimed countless lives, had completely slipped through the net. He had stood in the shadows, silently watching the police arrest innocent people, watching the courts convict a grieving man, and relishing the arrogance of a perfect escape. Justice had been blinded, manipulated, and ultimately defeated by darkness. The resounding failure of the investigations and trials left an indelible scar on the soul of the city. The residents had to accept the nightmarish reality that absolute evil could operate with impunity, that brick walls and locked doors offered no guarantee of safety, and that law enforcement, despite their weapons and patrols, was utterly powerless against such an elusive predator. The Phantom Killer had won. He had committed his atrocities, terrorized a thriving capital, forced a complete redefinition of urban space and nighttime security, before vanishing into history, leaving behind an unsolvable enigma and a legacy of pure fear. The court files of James Phillips and John Hancock were filed away, piled in the dusty archives of the courthouse, silent monuments to one of the most desperate miscarriages of justice in Texas history. And while the innocent men tried to rebuild the ruins of their lives, the real murderer slipped away into the night, taking with him the secret of his identity, a secret that would forever remain buried in the unfathomable abyss of unsolved crimes. The judicial resolution of this case was no resolution at all. It was a complete collapse of the values of security. The appeals court's decision, though just and desperately necessary, acted as a blinding mirror held up to late 19th century Texas society, reflecting its darkest prejudices, structural inadequacy, and primal terror of the unknown. The police officers had to return to patrol the streets they were meant to protect, knowing deep down that they had not only failed to stop the diabolical carnage, but had actively participated in the destruction of innocent lives to mask their own panic and incompetence. The public's fundamental trust in the institution of justice evaporated in the cold winter air, replaced by a profound cynicism and a persistent, toxic paranoia that fiercely refused to die. Even with the sudden cessation of the bloody murders, the cruel lack of conclusive evidence, the absence of a genuine confession, or the lack of a fair trial for the true sadistic killer left a psychological wound open in the city's historical narrative. Austin's residents never again slept a truly deep and restorative sleep. Every faint creak of wooden floorboards, every long shadow cast by the full moon through the fragile bedroom window, served as a reminder of the tragic failure of their defenses and the chilling impunity of the elusive monster who had walked among them. The tortuous trial brought absolutely no emotional or legal closure. It simply, tragically, and irrevocably confirmed the absolute horror. Evil had arrived uninvited, taken precisely what it desired with inhuman ferocity, and retreated into the gaping darkness, without ever having to face the light of justice. The deafening silence that followed this macabre series of murders brought no real comfort to the tormented souls of the Texas capital, for the sudden absence of bloodshed presented an enigma as terrifying as the nightly carnage itself, leaving behind a heavy atmosphere, thick with perpetual dread, transforming each twilight into an agonizing reminder of human vulnerability in the face of unfathomable darkness. The once carefree citizens remained prisoners of a pathological vigilance, relentlessly scrutinizing the flickering shadows cast upon the Victorian facades, secretly dreading the inevitable return of that primal destructive force that had so profoundly altered the social fabric, instilling a visceral distrust between neighbors. Reinforced locks, makeshift barricades, and loaded firearms became the daily symbols of a community irrevocably fractured by the psychological fear of a monster. An anonymous figure who not only stole innocent lives but murdered the very innocence of an entire nascent metropolis, imposing a nightmarish new reality where the family home was no longer an inviolable refuge, transcending generations to become an indelible cultural scar that continues to throb painfully long after the blood has dried on the dust of winding alleyways, silently dictating nocturnal behaviors and shaping urban policies for decades to come, the most tangible, spectacular, and lasting imprint of which finally materialized 10 years later in the form of an unprecedented urban engineering project, born directly from this paralyzing phobia of darkness, when, In 1895, driven by the visceral need to banish deadly threats once and for all, the municipality commissioned the installation of a complex network of giant lighting towers, affectionately nicknamed the famous Moonlight Towers. These gigantic metal structures rising gracefully to more than 50 meters high, strategically erected throughout the urban area to bathe every street, every alley, and every backyard in a constant, pale, and protective artificial glow, initially designed to dispel collective anxiety, acting as iron sentinels illuminated by powerful carbon arc lamps, symbolizing humanity's desperate attempt to conquer the night, to ward off invisible demons and restore a semblance of peace of mind to the traumatized inhabitants, so that today, although modern lighting has rendered their original function largely obsolete, several of these iconic monuments still stand proudly in Austin's contemporary skyline, jealously guarded as historical relics. To the unsuspecting tourist, they appear as mere picturesque architectural curiosities from a bygone era of industrial innovation. However, to those who know the macabre genesis of their existence, these luminous pillars represent immense memorials, silent arrows pointing heavenward in remembrance of the unspeakable atrocities that once bloodied the earth below, embodying the literal petrification of terror, an outsized physical reaction to immeasurable emotional shock, constantly reminding passers-by that this city once had to construct artificial suns to survive its own nightmares. The impact of this singular affair, exceeding moreover, it largely transcends the region's geographical boundaries to tragically mark a turning point, a true cornerstone in the annals of modern criminology, for the Annihilator occupies a sinister, yet crucial place as the first truly formally documented serial killer on American soil, brutally redefining the parameters of deadly psychopathy long before the advent of forensic science. Thanks to a modus operandi characterized by extreme ritualistic violence, a selection of random targets based on weakness rather than personal connection, and a chilling ability to stealthily infiltrate enclosed environments, disturbingly anticipating the methods employed by other infamous figures who would terrorize the world in the following century, brutally tearing away the blinders of a naive society, demonstrating with terrifying clarity that absolute evil did not reside exclusively on distant battlefields or in unexplored wildernesses, but that it could thrive secretly in the very heart of flourishing urban civilization, lurking in the deceptive intimacy of residential neighborhoods, highlighting the stark contrast between the rudimentary technology of the investigators of the time, limited to simple lanterns and shaky deductions, and the terrifying sophistication of the assaults, underscoring the absolute urgency of developing new methods of scientific investigation, thus sowing the seeds of future techniques of psychological profiling, crime scene analysis, and forensic medicine that would become indispensable to future generations of law enforcement officers, making it imperative, in retrospect, to shift our attention from the fascinating anonymity of the murderer to the precious, and all too often overlooked, humanity of those who perished at his merciless blows. Molly, Eliza, Irene, Mary, Gracie, Orange, Susan, and Eula, 8 lives brutally cut short. 8 futures erased by the bloodthirsty madness of a faceless intruder, the first 6 victims, of which, composed mostly of African-American working women from the hard-working labor class, they suffered a heartbreaking double injustice, first savagely martyred by a cruel hand that despised their essence, then marginalized by a biased judicial system that only paid real attention to the carnage when the bloodshed began to stain the Persian carpets of white bourgeois homes, revealing that the true horror of this period lies not only in the unspeakable acts of butchery, but also in the abysmal societal disparities that left these domestic workers so tragically exposed, isolated in their flimsy huts, devoid of any adequate protection, their agonizing deaths serving as an implacable mirror, reflecting systemic inequalities, persistent racial prejudices, and the cruel indifference of an era when an individual's worth was cruelly quantified by social status, ethnicity, or postal address, imposing upon us the absolute moral duty, in revisiting this dark chapter, to pronounce their names with solemn respect, to restore their posthumous dignity, and to remember them not as mere morbid statistics in an unsolved case, but as individuals in their own right, possessing dreams, families, sorrows, and joys obliterated in the most ignoble way imaginable, particularly little Mary, an innocent 11-year-old girl whose infinite potential was cruelly annihilated before it could even blossom, representing the pinnacle of brutality devoid of any moral compass, an act of such pure perversity that it still defies our capacity for rational understanding, ultimately uniting all classes, including the wealthy women who fell on Christmas Eve, in a shared vulnerability to the inherent fragility of carnal existence, proving that civilization, with all its imposing structures, complex laws, armed patrols, and moral codes, remains an extraordinarily thin veneer, liable to be chipped at any moment by the sudden and unpredictable eruption of primal human monstrosity, lending this tale an almost mythological dimension since the culprit's identity was never formally established, their face remaining forever hidden beneath the veil impenetrable by historical anonymity, transforming this individual into a timeless allegory of our deepest fears, of that unspeakable threat perpetually lurking just beyond the edge of light, becoming a true bogeyman, a spectral force still whispering in the Texas night wind, tirelessly reminding us that some unfathomable mysteries are destined to remain prisoners of their own darkness, eternally eluding earthly justice, judged only by the implacable tribunal of time, echoing softly through the decades to warn us each time the moonlight illuminates the quiet avenues, mingling with the electric glow of modern streetlights and glittering skyscrapers, concluding the story of America's first serial predator without cathartic resolution, without grandiloquent confessions, without the reassuring image of a criminal chained behind bars, forcing us to accept the painful ambiguity of unfinished investigations, composing an unfinished symphony of terror whose final notes hang in the void, demanding that we bear the burden of memory to ensure that the spirits of the departed continue to exist in our collective consciousness, thus illuminating our own inner darkness, for in the end, the killer may have physically escaped the executioner's noose and the chains of prison, taking his secret with him. Unspeakable in an unknown grave, but its true defeat lies in our persistent ability to recount these events, to honor the resilient memory of those who perished, and to stubbornly refuse to let their tragic existences dissipate completely into the amnesiac fog of oblivion, demonstrating that this enduring fascination felt more than a century later for this impenetrable mystery does not stem from an unhealthy morbidity, but rather from a profound ontological need to find meaning in absolute chaos, to restructure the terrifying disorder through storytelling, erecting a narrative monument against destructive madness, recounting these grim chronicles with gravity to wrest power from the anonymity of evil, deconstructing its aura with the light of analysis, the warmth of empathy, and the force of restored historical truth, placing these innocent souls, once relegated to the obscure margins of period newspapers, back at the center of our attention, resurrected by the power of modern compassion, definitively proving that while the physical body is atrociously perishable, memory remains an impregnable fortress capable of defying the ravages of brutality, offering a form of timeless, ultimate, serene, extraordinarily powerful poetic justice to those who were cruelly deprived of it during their short existence on this earth, making us realize, as we scrutinize one last time the contemporary horizon where the macabre past silently intertwines with present vitality, that the true legacy of this dark epic is definitely not the absolute triumph of debilitating fear, but on the contrary the dazzling confirmation of our unalterable duty to bear witness, to cherish, and to remember eternally, so that the flame of truth continues to shine with resilience, relentlessly dispersing the threatening shadows that desperately try to erase the names engraved in the marble of our common history, ensuring that light will always triumph over the abyss of night. Today, meticulously traversing the asphalt arteries of the Texas metropolis offers a sensory experience diametrically opposed to the twilight torments of the 19th century, for this flourishing capital has metamorphosed into a buzzing technological epicenter, saturated with digital innovations, dotted with glittering skyscrapers boldly reflecting contemporary optimism, where cosmopolitan crowds stroll peacefully beneath glittering commercial neon lights, superbly ignoring the historical strata buried under reinforced concrete, thus creating a striking, almost dizzying contrast with the muddy alleyways of yesteryear where the unspeakable once lurked, demonstrating the incredible resilience of human agglomerations capable of healing their most gaping topographical wounds by frantically layering material progress over the traumas of the past, literally swallowing the original crime scenes beneath foundation's steel structures, trendy cafes, avant-garde art galleries, and imposing luxury residential complexes have transformed the former macabre hunting ground into a hyper-connected urban theater. The primary concern of today's citizens is more about the smooth flow of car traffic or the fluctuation of virtual markets than the imminence of a barbaric attack perpetrated with rusty axes. This perfectly illustrates the fascinating sociological phenomenon of environmental amnesia, the collective ability to purge public space of its bloody memories to allow daily life to flourish without being perpetually hampered by the suffocating weight of past tragedies. Although a few discerning minds, true archaeologists of the gloom, still manage to detect the ghostly whispers of the annihilator echoing faintly between the modernist glass facades, reminding us with melancholic insistence that every patch of civilized land inevitably rests on foundations of forgotten stories, of unspoken suffering, and of unsolved mysteries defying the merciless wear and tear of time. Let us imagine for a moment, through an alternate history thought experiment, the captivating hypothesis where this grim series of abominable murders unfolds in our current timeline, confronting this sadistic predator with a formidable arsenal of 21st century forensic science. This virtual scenario drastically alters the trajectory of the initial criminal investigation, as the elusive specter of the past would brutally collide with an implacable technological omnipresence, beginning with the dense network of high-definition CCTV cameras lining every intersection, every residential porch, ready to capture the slightest suspicious figure lurking in the shadows. This obliterates the visual anonymity once enjoyed by the executioner, while the smallest drop of blood left on the handle of an abandoned weapon, the tiniest fragment of skin torn away during a desperate struggle, or even a single hair follicle. A stray trace at the scene of carnage would instantly transform into an indelible biological signature, rapidly sequenced by ultra-powerful genetic algorithms capable of tracing the culprit's complete ancestry. This precious data would be cross-referenced with global criminal databases, not to mention the invaluable contribution of modern behavioral profiling, using complex psychological models to anticipate the killer's next moves, analyze their deep-seated motivations, and circumscribe their geographical area of operation. This would transform the blind and panicked pursuit of police officers of yesteryear into a methodical, clinical, almost mathematical scientific hunt, undeniably proving that the Victorian era offered a providential sanctuary to disturbed minds, a bygone era when the absence of tangible material evidence constituted the ultimate shield against barbarity. This forces us to admit that the impunity of this specific criminal was intrinsically linked to the technical limitations of his time, a confluence of historical circumstances that tragically favored the flourishing rise of the absolute evil. This frustrating inaccessibility of the truth ironically propelled this murderous stranger into a mythological dimension, shaping a veritable psychological archetype of pure evil. For the human mind, confronted with the unfathomable abyss of the unexplained, naturally tends to fill rational gaps by creating terrifying chimeras, transforming a mere mortal, however deviant, into a supernatural entity, an invincible, omnipotent bogeyman, crystallizing all the existential anxieties of a community facing the unpredictability of a violent death. This cognitive phenomenon served as a paradoxical defense mechanism, since by dehumanizing the aggressor, by elevating him to the status of an elusive demon, the citizens of Austin were desperately trying to mitigate the unbearable reality that atrocities of such magnitude could be perpetrated by a fellow human being, a being of flesh breathing the same air, walking the same sidewalks, a potential neighbor. Concealing his sadistic impulses behind the placid mask of everyday normality, demonstrating that our morbid fascination with unsolved cases stems directly from this insoluble tension between the visceral need to understand criminal motives and the impossibility of obtaining clear answers, creating a narrative void that irresistibly sucks in our imagination, pushing us to elaborate countless conspiracy theories, audacious conjectures linking this assassin to the London backstreets of Jack the Ripper, frantically seeking to weave invisible threads between different manifestations of chaos in an attempt to impose an artificial order on the inherent anarchy of depraved nature, proving that the butcher's dreadful legacy lies not only in the mutilated corpses, but above all in the gaping psychological scar imprinted on the collective consciousness. Beyond purely police considerations, this century-old case resonates today as a powerful sociological mirror, reflecting with crushing cruelty the structural fractures, systemic prejudices, and oppressive hierarchies that characterized post-Civil War Southern society. It underscores the crucial importance of adopting an intersectional perspective when retrospectively analyzing tragedies, because ignoring the minority status, working-class condition, and intrinsic vulnerability of the first African American women targeted would be to amputate history of its most painful substance. It compels us to recognize that the murderer consciously exploited these racial divisions, knowing full well that the justice system placed infinitely less value on lives relegated to the miserable margins of the city, transforming these domestic workers into prime targets, easy to isolate, easy to erase, whose cries for help remained tragically stifled by the wall of bourgeois indifference. A lesson of burning contemporary relevance. This resonates strongly with current debates regarding disparities in media coverage of disappearances involving marginalized minorities, serving as a stark reminder that true fairness is not measured by the verdicts handed down, but rather by a nation's capacity to adequately protect all its members, regardless of their ancestry, heritage, or social standing. It transforms this grim historical narrative into a powerful modern plea for equality, institutional empathy, and civic vigilance, urging future generations to dismantle the mechanisms of oppression that indirectly facilitate the impunity of predators in the night. It is also worth analyzing the decisive impact of the print media on the asymmetrical legacy of these dark annals, raising a dizzying question as to the precise reasons why the Texan ghost remains an obscure footnote compared to the Whitechapel monster, whose pseudonym resonates universally. This disparity is largely explained by the journalistic context of the time, as Victorian England already possessed a flourishing sensationalist industry, hungry for scandals, capable of instantly disseminating macabre descriptions across an entire global empire, creating a hysterical feedback loop between the fascinated public and greedy publishers. Meanwhile, the Lone Star State of the 1880s, although prosperous, remained perceived as a relatively isolated frontier, a distant territory whose carnage struggled to capture the sustained attention of the major metropolitan centers of the American East Coast or the European continent, proving that posthumous fame, the reputation of a deranged individual, paradoxically depends not so much on the intrinsic horror of their actions, their macabre tally, or the audacity of their executions, but rather on the media machinery surrounding their crimes, their fortuitous ability to fit into the cultural zeitgeist of the moment, and the skill of reporters in forging a catchy mythology, highlighting the cruel arbitrariness of memory which chooses to canonize certain abominations while relegating other equally terrifying massacres to the dusty oubliettes of local archives. A phenomenon confirming our responsibility to exhume these forgotten files in order to grant them the rigorous exposure they amply deserve, refusing to let the editorial dynamics of the past dictate contemporary tributes. The narrative act of recounting these dark events is also part of the ongoing evolution of our relationship to true crime, raising fundamental ethical questions about how we consume, process, and share these accounts of authentic violence. It demands an infinitely delicate balance between rigorous historical investigation and the sacred respect due to the deceased, carefully avoiding the voyeuristic pitfall of glamorizing the figure of the murderer at the expense of their victims, a sadly all too common tendency in some current entertainment productions. Instead, it requires an approach imbued with solemnity, compassion, and decency, using the investigative podcast format not as a mere horror show designed to provide fleeting thrills, but rather as a powerful educational tool, an audio memorial that gives a vibrant voice back to those who were violently silenced, dissects the mechanisms of fear, helps us understand the flaws in our systems of protection, and honors the memory of lives cut short. These works are doomed. For every word spoken, every meticulously crafted sentence used to describe these atrocities must invariably serve a higher purpose, that of restorative truth, of educational prevention, transforming the listener from a passive consumer of frightening stories into an active witness to the past. A guardian charged with ensuring that the lessons learned from these bloodbaths do not simply evaporate into the insidious mists of indifference, proving that documentary literature possesses the extraordinary redemptive power to transcend horror and extract from it a profound humanistic wisdom, absolutely essential to the elevation of our global moral conscience. Finally, as we majestically contemplate the last surviving light towers soaring bravely towards the celestial vault, these proud, stoic steel needles braving decades of weathering, we are inevitably struck by their overwhelming poetic symbolism. For these colossal structures, initially conceived as mere technological bulwarks against a tangible nightmare, have slowly transmuted into beacons of hope, material emblems of the resounding victory of light over darkness, of human resilience in the face of unspeakable barbarity, silently radiating a message of timeless perseverance, whispering to the southern wind that while predators do exist, lurking in the dark recesses of our world, the collective will to survive, to help one another, to protect the innocent, and to preserve memory always proves infinitely more vigorous, more enduring, more radiant than the sharp blade of any assailant, thus sealing the final chapter of this painful epic on a vibrant note of triumphant humanity, guarantees that the true legacy of this drama will never be defined by the destructive rampages of a fallen individual, but rather by the indomitable strength of a community that categorically refused to be swallowed up by its own anguish, deliberately choosing to forge its own protective brilliance, to ward off fate through artificial illumination, and to march resolutely towards the future while keeping a place of honor in the inviolable sanctuary of its heart for those 8 sacrificed souls whose physical absence continues, paradoxically, to silently guide the uncertain steps of the living. Investigating unsolved mysteries inevitably creates profound cognitive dissonance within our mental framework because the human intellect, intrinsically wired to demand clear resolutions and proportionate punishments, violently rejects the dizzying notion of perfect impunity. When a murderer miraculously slips through the net of the law, vanishing without a trace, he instantly transforms into a formidable allegorical figure, an insidious myth contaminating our overall perception of security. This Texas annihilator, this bloodthirsty specter who ravaged Austin homes, majestically embodies this analytical paralysis. The cruel inaccessibility of his psychological motivations, the complete absence of a reliable composite sketch, and the utter emptiness of any rational motive open a gaping chasm in our understanding of psychopathy. We are thus forced to navigate blindly on an ocean of endless speculation, where every deduction crashes miserably against the impregnable fortress of its anonymity. This persistent opacity acts like an intellectual toxin, subtly distilling anxiety into the heart of the collective psyche, transforming a simple closed criminal case into a tenacious cultural obsession. Those who lived through the tragedy, as well as today's puzzle enthusiasts, remain willing hostages of an unfinished quest for meaning, frantically searching the margins of history to unearth the missing clue. Nevertheless, conceding victory to this unknowability requires a rare philosophical humility, demanding the serene admission that extreme savagery often dispenses with reassuring explanations. Absolute vice, in its most primitive manifestation, is not accompanied by any ideological manifesto. It destroys mechanically, then disappears, abandoning the survivors to the immensity of their powerlessness. This terrifying reality underlines that the ultimate horror does not stem solely from the bloodshed, but is deeply rooted in our chronic inability to identify the monster, proving that imposed ignorance constitutes the most enduring psychological torture, a posthumous punishment inflicted on a community unable to close the bloody parenthesis of its tumultuous past. leaving an open wound that stubbornly refuses to heal despite the relentless passage of decades. Venturing among the documentary relics carefully preserved in the county's institutional basements is akin to embarking on a melancholic pilgrimage through the ruins of human suffering, where each typed transcript, each rough sketch outlining the morbid geometry of mutilated bodies, represents a desperately fragile vestige. These vulnerable legal parchments, their ink inexorably fading under the constant onslaught of atmospheric oxidation, form the last physical bulwark against the total oblivion of this murderous frenzy. The instruments of torture, those agricultural tools repurposed from their nourishing function to split innocent skulls, have presumably been swallowed up by the limbo of administration, thus depriving modern investigators of any opportunity to apply their revolutionary genetic protocols to once invisible biological fibers. This slow decay of incriminating evidence illustrates, with poetic cruelty, the perishable nature of institutional justice. However, while matter irrevocably disintegrates, the spoken word unfolds with an astonishing, almost supernatural vitality. The oral or literary transcription of these unspeakable horrors, traveling from the frightened whispers once exchanged in local taverns to contemporary global digital broadcasts, confers an aura of immortality upon these suburban tragedies. Continuously recounting the details of this massacre transcends mere morbid chronicle to rise to the level of an essential duty of remembrance, constituting an intangible shield against the final erasure of the martyrs. By breathing our present-day breath into these desiccated archives, by lending our vocal cords to the long-suppressed death rattles, we are building an incorruptible sonic pantheon. This narrative architecture fiercely resists the erosion of centuries, transforming a series of resounding police failures into a masterclass in social history, relentlessly reminding us that the careful preservation of dark stories remains our only effective weapon to ward off the cyclical return of predatory entities perpetually haunting the blurry interstices of our supposedly evolved civilization. A retrospective examination of the sociological dynamics surrounding this sordid affair reveals a damning panorama of the discriminatory stratifications that plagued the post-secession era, highlighting the terrifying vulnerability of minorities systematically relegated to the margins of civil protection. The first targets of this elusive butcher were by no means chosen at random. They embodied the most neglected segment of the population, African American domestic workers whose very existence was relegated to invisible servitude, confined to dilapidated shacks devoid of even the most basic safety measures. Their successive disappearances initially provoked only mild outrage among the ruling elite, illustrating a chilling institutional contempt where the value of a life was measured solely by skin pigmentation and accumulated wealth. It was only at the precise moment when the assailant's heavy blade tragically crossed the threshold of the wealthy patrician homes, felling respectable bourgeois women, that panic truly gripped the upper echelons of society, triggering a hysterical but sadly belated military mobilization. This unjust segregation in the face of death constitutes the second tragedy, perhaps the most morally revolting, of this sprawling case. Restoring the violated dignity of Molly, Eliza, Irene, Mary, Gracie, and Orange requires a meticulous deconstruction of the usual sensationalism, forcing us to refocus our analytical lens on their stolen humanity. Documenting their ordeal without omitting the systemic racism that greatly facilitated their sacrifice is an absolute ethical obligation for any truly honest chronicler. Listening to the echo of their ghostly footsteps reverberating in the cobbled alleyways, we perceive not only the chilling sound of an imminent threat, but also the disapproving murmur of a society made complicit by its crass negligence. Their wandering souls do not merely demand the hypothetical arrest of a deranged individual buried underground. They demand the perpetual recognition of their status as fully human beings, transforming this fledgling investigation into a timeless indictment of all forms of structural inequality that continue, even today, to cynically designate ideal prey for the new urban torturers. The singular imprint left by this destructive abomination unwittingly laid the macabre groundwork for modern behavioral profiling, unknowingly establishing the theoretical foundations for understanding the clinical concept of the serial killer, a criminological term that didn't even exist in the rudimentary vocabulary of 19th century sheriffs. The meticulous methodology deployed during the multiple assaults, the stealthy spatial invasion, the disproportionate blunt force applied with precision, the humiliating ritual of publicly displaying the desecrated remains, and the arrogant signature of the lethal tool left behind, outlines the terrifying contours of an infinitely complex psychopathology, foreshadowing the worst human demons that would tragically mark the decades to come. This pioneering case demonstrates with brutal clarity that intraspecific predation is not at all dependent on mercenary material gain, but is invariably fueled by a morbid will to absolute domination, an insatiable thirst for supremacy exercised exclusively at the expense of innocent flesh. Understanding the evolution of this deviant typology requires analyzing how the annihilator manipulated the nocturnal environment, using natural shadows as a formidable cloak of invisibility to orchestrate its theater of cruelty. This theatrical display of violence, deliberately designed to shock the community and openly defy the authorities, marked a decisive turning point in the history of American crime, transforming murder from an isolated act of passion into a veritable campaign of calculated psychological terror, planned and executed with a reptilian coldness that defied all compassionate logic. This forced future generations of law enforcement professionals to completely rethink their investigative paradigms in the face of an unprecedented, methodical savagery. The complex anatomy of this terror, as it was viscerally experienced by the terrified inhabitants of this flourishing metropolis, deserves in-depth sociological introspection, for it perfectly illustrates the frightening malleability of the herd mentality in the face of a stealthy and undetectable threat. Panic was no longer content to merely skim the surface of everyday life. It seeped insidiously into the very veins of the city, dictating every social interaction, altering the defensive architecture of homes, and irrevocably altering the perception of the once peaceful domestic sanctuary. The mere furtive creak of a floorboard, the subtle rustle of leaves caressed by the autumn wind, or the distant howl of a stray dog instantly transformed into deafening alarm bells, triggering paralyzing cold sweats and uncontrollable tachycardia in the barricaded citizens. This toxic atmosphere of pervasive suspicion literally pulverized the bonds of neighborly solidarity, transforming every unknown individual into a potential suspect, a harbinger of death disguised as an entirely ordinary person. It is precisely this insidious erosion of mutual trust that constitutes the predator's most striking strategic victory, having succeeded in implanting the virulent germ of paranoia far beyond the confines of the crime scenes, permanently infecting the collective imagination of an entire population. Today, as we walk across these same lands, now covered in smooth asphalt and lined with gleaming futuristic skyscrapers, it remains imperative to feel, if only for a fraction of a second, the crushing burden of this anxiety-inducing legacy. The philosophical lessons drawn from this collective hysteria resonate powerfully in the contemporary era, where other forms of peril, sometimes technologically more sophisticated but just as insidious, regularly attempt to fracture our precious social cohesion. The tragic epic of the Annihilator thus goes far beyond the strict framework of a macabre regional news item to become a timeless, universal allegory of the perpetual struggle opposing the reassuring civilizing order to the destructive instinctive chaos, recalling the precarious balance, maintaining our veneer of humanity intact in the face of the darkest impulses of our own species. As we finally close this suffocating chapter, our gaze instinctively turns to the shimmering skies of the Texas firmament, where the gigantic moonlit towers, those imposing steel obelisks erected in direct reaction to this devastating psychosis, continue peacefully to cast their protective halo over the sleeping boulevards. These tall, luminous sentinels embody humanity's desperate, yet magnificently poetic, attempt to tame the darkness, to banish tangible nightmares with blinding kilowatts. They symbolize our unwavering resilience, our categorical refusal to capitulate cowardly to the creeping shadows threatening our children. As the narrator's deep voice slowly fades, giving way to a heavy silence conducive to meditation, a fervent secular prayer rises for the eternal rest of the forgotten victims. May their vibrant memory serve as a perpetual warning to the living, underscoring that the fine line separating the gentle tranquility of domestic life from absolute, bloody barbarity remains alarmingly fragile. We, attentive listeners and contemporary guardians of these grim chronicles, now bear the heavy civic responsibility of keeping this flickering flame of memory alive, for courageously scrutinizing the terrifying darkness of the past is the only way to effectively illuminate the unpredictable perils of the future. Ensuring that convenient amnesia will never complete the destructive work begun by the acts of a fleeting unknown assailant becomes our sacred mission. Ultimately, while the infamous butcher skillfully managed to physically escape from earthly prisons, his ghostly imprint paradoxically forces us to remain constantly vigilant, proving that true security lies infinitely less in the physical thickness of our fortified walls than in the invincible solidity of our communal compassion, affirming our unalterable ability to stand together, united and determined, when voracious darkness tries to engulf the inextinguishable light of our shared brotherhood. Plunging inexorably into the unfathomable depths of this age-old enigma requires dizzying intellectual audacity, for meticulously dissecting the poison legacy left by this phantom assassin confronts us harshly with the inherent limits of our own rationality, revealing the terrifying vulnerability of a supposedly invincible civilization in the face of the unpredictable onslaught of primordial chaos, demanding a painful introspection on the extreme fragility of the human condition. The in-depth study of the psychological repercussions of this bloody Texan odyssey gleefully transcends the simple framework of classic criminal investigation to subtly intrude upon the obscure meanders of behavioral sociology, examining how a visceral, invisible, and omnipresent fear possesses the destructive power to completely reshape the dynamics of a bustling metropolis, altering even the very foundations of daily social interaction. Once seen as a promising haven of prosperity, the small town of Austin was suddenly transformed into an oppressive shadow play, where every citizen, gripped by rampant paranoia, anxiously scrutinized the faces of their neighbors, fearing to detect the hidden features of the bloodthirsty monster responsible for the worst atrocities ever perpetrated on this southern territory, creating a suffocating climate of suspicion. This widespread mistrust acted like a corrosive acid, rapidly dissolving intercommunal solidarity, erecting insurmountable mental barriers between different segments of the population, and cruelly exacerbating pre-existing racial tensions, demonstrating the propensity of paroxysmal crises to reveal the deepest fractures in a society. Marginalized minorities, already heavily burdened by the crushing weight of ruthless systemic discrimination, have found themselves tragically trapped at the center of an absurd legal maelstrom, becoming the convenient scapegoats of an incompetent police force desperately trying to appease the hysteria of panicked bourgeois elites. The arbitrary arrest of dozens of innocent men, brutally dragged from their grieving homes to endure shockingly savage interrogations, starkly illustrates the inevitable tendency of crumbling institutions to sacrifice justice on the altar of political expediency when faced with utter impotence. It remains imperative to stress that this procedural charade did not in any way curb the murderous zeal of the real culprit, who continued to operate with chilling impunity, openly defying law enforcement, taunting heavily armed civilian patrols, and demonstrating an astonishing geographical mastery of the surrounding muddy alleyways, navigating through the security network with the disconcerting ease of a supreme predator. The appalling audacity of the two latest assassinations, committed simultaneously on the symbolic night of Christmas, represents the macabre culmination of his arrogance, a truly stinging blow to the face of a vain society that naively believed it could tame the darkness with mere wrought iron locks and a few loaded rifles. The authorities' blatant inability to stem this bloodshed has sent shockwaves through the country, the seismic ripples of which have permanently eroded public trust in the state security apparatus, sowing pernicious doubt about the government's actual capacity to protect its most vulnerable citizens from a stealthy threat. Exploring the intangible remnants of this bygone era, the contemporary observer cannot help but be struck by the unsettling similarity between this ancestral panic and the modern anxieties generated by serial criminals stealthily navigating the labyrinth of our hyper-connected world, underscoring the timeless universality of dread. Although rusty axes have been advantageously replaced by sophisticated technological weapons, the fundamental terror inspired by the sudden intrusion of a lethal threat into our very personal space remains chillingly constant, undeniably proving that humanity's rapid material evolution has utterly failed to eradicate our most deeply ingrained, primal phobias, rooted in our reptilian brain. This enduring horror lends a universal philosophical dimension to the Annihilator saga, elevating this sordid news item to the status of an existential fable addressing the inherent fragility of physical life in the face of the unpredictability of savage destruction. Examining the abject details of these unsolved executions is therefore in no way a matter of unhealthy voyeurism or self-indulgent morbidity, but rather constitutes a rigorous epistemological approach aimed at deciphering the complex mechanisms of human cruelty pushed to its absolute extreme. Each fatal wound inflicted, each mutilation orchestrated with almost surgical precision, testifies to a deliberate will to annihilate not only the physical form of the prey, but also its symbolic integrity, reducing complex individuals to the state of mere objects of flesh tortured for the pleasure of a demented mind. This barbaric objectification of victims, particularly evident in post-mortem abuse, reveals the torturer's singularly deviant mental makeup, a being driven by a compulsive need for absolute supremacy, frantically seeking to compensate for an unfathomable inner void through the tyrannical exercise of life and death power over others. The striking absence of financial motivation, combined with the reckless risk-taking inherent in the executioner's modus operandi, disturbingly anticipates the psychiatric profiles of contemporary serial killers, making this Texan predator a dark and unfortunately little-known pioneer in the annals of modern criminological pathology. The most biting irony lies in the fact that this sadistic sophistication clashed with an era utterly devoid of the scientific tools necessary to analyze it rationally, let alone effectively combat it in the field. The investigators of yesteryear, equipped only with their rudimentary deductions and flickering lanterns, were tragically like lost children vainly trying to grasp the power of a devastating hurricane, desperately battling a chaotic elemental force that immeasurably overwhelmed them on every tactical level. The collective amnesia that gradually shrouded these disastrous episodes in a thick veil of silence is largely explained by this crushing sense of capitulation. The local population preferred to bury the painful memory of their utter humiliation rather than perpetually confront the mocking specter of an undefeated monster that had humiliated its defenders. Nevertheless, the imposing metal towers, erected like luminous sentinels in the Austin sky, remain silent witnesses to this primal trauma, stubbornly reminding us that the electric light now bathing the pacified avenues was initially conceived as a desperate technological talisman meant to ward off nocturnal abominations. These gigantic, dizzying pylons, far exceeding their original utilitarian function, embody the admirable resilience of a city refusing to be paralyzed indefinitely by despair, illustrating humanity's phenomenal capacity to transmute its most unspeakable panics into grandiose architectural feats designed to reassure future generations. As the sensitive passerby strolls peacefully along the asphalt sidewalks of the contemporary capital, they occasionally hear a fleeting lament carried on the warm breezes, a reminder of the ephemeral existence of these innocent souls whose paths were so brutally severed by a merciless axe. Molly, Eliza, Irene, Mary, Gracie, Orange, Susan, and Eula are by no means mere dusty marginal notes in the records of an obsolete court. They embody the very essence of martyrdom, sacrificed on the altar of a fatal circumstance that temporarily granted victory to savagery over fledgling civilization. To pay a vibrant tribute to their desecrated memory requires an unwavering moral commitment, a fierce determination to prevent the victorious anonymity of the assailant from forever eclipsing the irreplaceable preciousness of their unique identities. The distressing impotence of the judicial system to provide them with even a shred of physical redress places upon us an invaluable burden of memory, the sacred obligation to continually narrate their ordeal to prevent the indifference of time from completing the destructive work begun by the edge of steel. The perpetuation of this historical narrative resonates like a conjuring incantation, a narrative exorcism that restores a vibrant presence to those who were silenced forever, forging an unalterable textual monument capable of withstanding the abrasive winds of widespread oblivion. While the impenetrable veil of uncertainty forever conceals the true face of the guilty, ensuring them a comfortable retreat in the unfathomable mists of history, our thirst for answers, though condemned to perpetual dissatisfaction, retains a paramount ethical validity, urging us to gaze lucidly into the depths of the abyss. This quest compels us to accept the latent presence of an endemic malignancy, silently slithering beneath the reassuring veneer of our daily lives, calling us to the utmost humility in the face of the unpredictability of a blind scourge that strikes without warning. The butcher did not merely slaughter precarious workers and wealthy wives. He slit the throat of the childish illusion of domestic invulnerability, bequeathing a legacy of caution whose philosophical shockwaves are still keenly felt in our current ultra-secure societies. His shadowy figure, stretching disproportionately across the decades, commands us to maintain vigilant vigilance, never to overlook the phenomenal capacity for harm lurking behind the apparent banality of things, and to value every moment of tranquility as an extremely rare privilege. Completing this suffocating journey through the darkness of the American West offers no cathartic release, no narrative relief, since the very heart of this mystery throbs with its irreducible incompleteness, leaving us suspended on the edge of a vertiginous precipice. We remain deprived of definitive verdicts, confined to the thorny labyrinth of unverifiable hypotheses, condemned to speculate endlessly on the identity of the boogeyman who escaped the executioner's noose. Yet, it is precisely this cruel informational void that ensures the tragedy's enduring presence in our collective minds, the gaping enigma acting as a powerful cognitive magnet, fueling our intellectual fascination while guaranteeing that the victims escape the final shipwreck of human consciousness. Ultimately, while this phantom assassin undoubtedly achieved a macabre strategic victory by outwitting the magistrates, his triumph pales in comparison to the invincible endurance of the retrospective empathy mobilized by today's chroniclers. The meticulous account of his abominable acts, instead of glorifying his dark legend, erects an honorary pedestal underscoring the infinite value of the lives he stole, wielding memory as the ultimate weapon against destructive oblivion. Thus, when the Texas night unfurls its dark velvet across the urban horizon and the historic light towers activate with almost religious solemnity, they do not mourn the defeat of justice bygone days, but rather celebrate the formidable tenacity of the human spirit, brilliantly surviving horror to bear eternal witness, across the ages, to the undeniable primacy of light, compassion, and unwavering memory. The inexorable passage of time often acts as an anesthetic balm on the most festering urban wounds, continually layering new strata of frenetic activity over the deathly silences of the past, altering the sociological ecosystem to the point where the old topography of terror is almost unrecognizable to contemporary passers-by. The majestic Colorado River, meandering peacefully through the Texas conurbation, has seen countless generations of inhabitants pass along its silted banks, its tranquil waters silently carrying the remnants of an era when nocturnal dread dictated the rhythm of panting breaths behind hastily barricaded doors. This uninterrupted river current perfectly symbolizes the inexorable march of history, a natural force indifferent to carnal torments, washing away the hemorrhagic stains that once permeated the dusty soil, but proving utterly powerless to erase the memorial scars seared into the psyche of the region. Today, asphalt scorching under the summer sun has definitively replaced the sticky mud of the disreputable alleyways where the predator once ventured, while the fragile shacks of disjointed wood, precarious stages of the first tortures, have been mercilessly swept away by the hurricane of frenetic real estate development, giving way to brand-new architectural complexes, sanctuaries of reinforced concrete and tempered glass offering an illusion of absolute security to their wealthy tenants. Nevertheless, This rapid metamorphosis of the urban landscape cannot forever conceal the disturbing truth buried beneath its modern foundations, for every square inch of this vibrant metropolis rests irrevocably on soil fertilized by blatant injustice, demanding of the attentive visitor a posture of contemplation before the sacrificed souls whose martyrdom tragically paved the way to modernity. Understanding the colossal scope of this investigative fiasco requires abandoning our current technological certainties to embrace the profound vulnerability that characterized law enforcement at the dawn of the industrial age, a transitional period when fledgling forensics resembled more akin to haphazard divination than a rigorous scientific discipline. The sworn officers, lacking any rigorous analytical protocol, patrolled the scenes of atrocities with pathetic bravery, their smoky lanterns casting ghostly shadows on crucial clues they were cognitively incapable of deciphering, blithely trampling biological evidence that, nowadays, would be enough to swiftly send any criminal to death row. This staggering inadequacy between the surgical brutality of the assailant and the baffling amateurishness of the investigators created a gaping chasm in the social contract between the state and its citizens, demonstrating that government protection was a pipe dream when the enemy chose to operate outside traditional criminal patterns. The systemic failure to grasp this invisible enemy engendered an unprecedented crisis of legitimacy, forcing the terrified population to delegate its security to disorganized, heavily armed but panic-blinded self-defense militias, transforming the city into an unstable powder keg where the slightest suspicion risked triggering a bloody lynching. The executioner's true triumph, therefore, lies not in his macabre tally of kills, but rather in his staggering ability to disintegrate the moral fabric of an entire community, proving that a handful of strategically executed massacres are enough to plunge a supposedly advanced civilization into the throes of predatory barbarity, revealing the alarming thinness of the civilizing veneer with which we so complacently cloak ourselves. The unresolved nature of this series of murders seeps into our consciousness like a slow poison, an unbearable anomaly that clashes head-on with our ontological need for just retribution, for human nature viscerally abhors unsolved problems, especially when they involve acts of cruelty on such a scale. The unbearable idea that an individual, having methodically crushed women's skulls with a blunt axe, could have grown old peacefully, perhaps surrounded by a loving family, passing away peacefully in his bed without ever having to answer to earthly justice, provokes a profound intellectual nausea, a moral vertigo that calls into question the very existence of a benevolent cosmic order. This total impunity bestows upon the perpetrator of these atrocities an aura of undeserved invincibility, elevating him to the status of an omnipotent, malevolent deity when he was fundamentally nothing more than a cowardly opportunist, a mediocre sadist vilely exploiting the structural weaknesses of a profoundly unequal society to satisfy his most vilified destructive impulses. Deconstructing this poisonous mythology is the imperative duty of every historical chronicler, demanding that the murderer be stripped of his cloak of fantastical invulnerability to expose him under the harsh light of sociological reality, demonstrating that his macabre success stemmed far less from superior Machiavellian intelligence than from the tragic complicity of an environment riddled with racism, classism, and abject indifference toward the most vulnerable. By refusing to glorify the predator's supposed skill, we strip him of his posthumous power, restoring an ethical hierarchy where the memory of the martyrs definitively supplants the morbid fascination aroused by their anonymous torturer, affirming that true courage lay with these women struggling daily for their survival in a fundamentally hostile world. The retrospective exploration of the racial divisions that shaped the tragic unfolding of this affair underscores the crucial importance of intersectionality in the analysis of past tragedies, because omitting the determining influence of institutionalized xenophobia would be to amputate this narrative of its most poignant and revolting dimension. The first unfortunate victims, African American domestic workers relegated to the invisible margins of the domestic economy, accumulated vulnerabilities with tragic acuteness, simultaneously enduring gender domination, social relegation, and ethnic contempt, forming a desperately accessible target for a killer seeking to maximize horror while minimizing the risk of interception. The initial media and police treatment of their murders, marked by blatant apathy and a repugnant propensity to hastily criminalize their own male circles, demonstrates that the justice system of the time operated according to a scandalously asymmetrical value system, where the blood of black proletarians seemed to possess a less alarming pigmentation in the eyes of white magistrates. This segregation in the face of compassion only abruptly dissipated when the threat breached the hallowed confines of the affluent neighborhoods, directly endangering the matriarchs of the local bourgeoisie and triggering a shockwave that exposed the fundamental hypocrisy of a system that only felt truly attacked when its elites became the targets of savagery. Revisiting this differential treatment compels us to lucidly examine the cognitive biases that persist within our modern judicial institutions, using this age-old tragedy as a prism to reveal our own contemporary failings, demanding perpetual vigilance to ensure that the value of a human life is never subject to stock market fluctuations indexed to the victim's origin, bank account, or postal code. The very nature of our fascination with true crime stories deserves courageous introspection, for the assiduous consumption of these bloody narratives constantly skirts the fine line between solemn tribute and macabre entertainment, requiring unwavering moral discipline to avoid succumbing to complacent voyeurism. Venturing into listening to these documentary podcasts should in no way be a superficial quest for adrenaline, a fleeting thrill intended to alleviate the boredom of a Sunday commute, but rather a rigorous act of bearing witness, a spiritual presence offering compassionate listening to voices violently silenced. Each listener then becomes a sacred custodian of collective memory, a virtual guardian ensuring that the memory of these shattered lives does not evaporate into the throes of digital indifference, transforming the audio format into an immaterial memorial transcending spatial and temporal barriers. Through our sustained attention, we openly defy the murderer's campaign of annihilation, proving that his lethal weapon could only destroy physical bodies, ultimately proving powerless against the formidable resilience of shared human memory. The meticulous transmission of these tragic events performs a public service, serving as both educational and preventative, teaching future generations about the insidious mechanisms of predation, while simultaneously honoring the extraordinary bravery of those who confronted the unspeakable, establishing a profound understanding of evil as the most effective shield to prevent its eventual return to our hard-won communities. As twilight spreads its crimson cloak across the Austin skyline, the monumental historic light towers illuminate with mechanical regularity, casting their reassuring glow over the bustling avenues, poignant remnants of a bygone era when humanity naively hoped to ward off death with the power of electric arcs. These soaring structures, far from being mere obsolete engineering artifacts, embody the sublime materialization of urban resilience, a luminous scar stretching toward the celestial vault to proclaim civilization's ultimate victory over the dark impulses of destruction. Looking up at these incandescent halos, we no longer perceive the testimony of an ancestral panic, but the brilliant affirmation of a collective will to survive, a vibrant message of hope whispering that, even plunged into the most unfathomable darkness, light invariably ends up piercing the darkness, warming wounded hearts and guiding the lost towards peaceful tomorrows. The heartbreaking saga of the Annihilator concludes not with a bitter acknowledgement of judicial failure, but with a magnificent celebration of that irrepressible life force which drives men to tirelessly rebuild on the ruins of their despair, proving that the true legacy of this tragedy lies in our ability to transform unspeakable horror into an unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent, the relentless pursuit of justice, and the perpetual maintenance of the human spark in the face of the formidable onslaught of chaos inherent in our imperfect world. Ultimately, the final act of reverence requires setting aside complex theories, intricate sociological analyses, and morbid fascinations to return to the very essence of the tragedy, the immeasurable loss of 8 souls whose sole crime was crossing paths with an abomination incarnate. Let the wailing sirens of modern patrol cars, predictive algorithms, and genetic sequencing labs silently fade away to grant a moment of respectful stillness to Molly, Eliza, Irene, Mary, Gracie, Orange, Susan, and Eula, whose names should resonate like a sacred litany in the vast amphitheater of our memories. Their interrupted laughter, their aborted dreams, and their dashed hopes constitute the true substance of this painful epic, demanding our purest compassion and our most faithful remembrance to counterbalance the chilling cynicism of their elusive tormentor. May this meticulous chronicle, woven with threads of empathy and historical rigor, serve as their grand epitaph, demonstrating that beyond brutal death and flagrant injustice, the power of human love and the enduring spirit of fraternal tribute remain the only forces capable of granting true immortality. The night breeze gently sweeping across the Texas plains carries away the last vestiges of this centuries-old terror, leaving behind only profound peace, solemn contemplation, and the comforting certainty that, as long as voices exist to recount their ordeal, these martyrs will never truly know the chilling chill of final oblivion, resting eternally in the warm sanctuary of our shared history, definitively freed from the chains of fear. The completion of this macabre fresco cannot, however, definitively close the open book of our metaphysical questions, for prolonged confrontation with absolute evil inevitably leaves indelible marks on our collective consciousness, forcing us to accept the existence of unexplored shadows within the human psyche, dark corners where rationality collapses miserably in the face of the most destructive irrationality. The investigation into the handmade annihilator, despite its frustrating outcome and the eventual impunity of its perpetrator, remains a fundamental milestone in criminal historiography, a solemn warning reminding us that the security of our societies is never a given but a fragile edifice, constantly threatened by the chaotic upheavals of endemic violence. Walking the brightly lit streets of the modern city, the discerning observer can still perceive the muffled echo of these ancient tragedies, a spectral resonance mingling with the incessant hum of traffic and the casual conversations of unsuspecting passers-by. This paradoxical coexistence between the technological splendor of the present and the bloody vestiges of the past illustrates the remarkable adaptability of human settlements, capable of layering successive stages of oblivion and renewal over the anonymous graves of their martyrs. Yet, the true victory against oblivion lies not in the monumentality of urban structures or the sophistication of police protocols, but rather in our unwavering ethical commitment to keeping alive the names of Molly, Eliza, Irene, Mary, Gracie, Orange, Susan, and Eula, transforming their individual tragedies into an eternal, intangible memorial. This act of remembrance, far from fostering a sterile, morbid fascination, constitutes an act of humanist resistance against erasure, an insurmountable barrier erected against the trivialization of the suffering of the most vulnerable. By refusing to relegate these lives cut short to the status of mere dusty statistics, we reaffirm the absolute preciousness of every human existence and the imperative need to protect society's outcasts from the invisible predators who perpetually prowl the margins of civilization. The most valuable lesson conveyed by this somber saga lies in our duty of constant vigilance, in our unwavering refusal to succumb to indifference in the face of structural injustices that facilitate the task of executioners, and in our profound conviction that community solidarity remains our best shield against the voracious darkness. Thus, while the majestic moonlit towers continue to cast their benevolent glow upon the sleeping boulevards, they silently watch over a metropolis reconciled with its tormented history, bearing the stubborn hope that the light of truth and compassion will forever smooth over the gaping scars of the past, ensuring that the sacrifice of these innocents will not have been in vain, and that their memory will continue to illuminate the uncertain path of future generations, guiding their steps towards a more just, more awakened humanity and infinitely more protective of all its children wounded by the madness of the world.